Hello everyone, I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. In 2013, Argentina was shaken by a horrific case that captured the attention of both the national and international communities. The crime involved the brutal murder of a young woman, whose body was discovered in a river near the city of Rosario, a bustling area located in the province of Santa Fe. The case would later be dubbed the Ghost of the River, due to the mysterious circumstances surrounding her death and the chilling story that unfolded. The victim, 22-year-old Lucia Perez, was an aspiring student with a bright future ahead of her. She had recently moved to Rosario to pursue her studies in business administration. Lucia had come from a modest family in a rural town in the north of the country, and her parents had high hopes for her success. She was known for her hard-working nature and friendly personality. However, her promising future was abruptly cut short one fateful evening. On the night of March 13, 2013, Lucia attended a gathering with friends at a local cafe in the downtown area of Rosario. It was a typical evening out for young adults, with lively conversations and laughter filling the air. As the night wore on, Lucia decided to head home. She had not been feeling well, and her friends noticed that she appeared slightly disoriented. They offered to accompany her home, but Lucia insisted that she would be fine on her own. This would be the last time anyone saw her alive. The following morning, Lucia's body was discovered by a passerby in the Parana River, which ran just outside the city. The person who found the body immediately contacted the authorities, and the police were quick to respond. When the authorities arrived at the scene, they initially suspected that Lucia had drowned. However, upon closer examination, they discovered signs of foul play that led them to believe she had been murdered. Forensic experts noted several disturbing details about the condition of the body. Lucia had visible injuries on her face, and there were signs of strangulation. There were also marks on her arms, suggesting that she had been restrained before her death. The investigators were horrified by the brutality of the crime and immediately launched a full investigation. At first, the police were uncertain about the exact cause of Lucia's death. The authorities did not find any immediate leads, and the case seemed to grow colder with each passing day. However, in the days following the discovery of her body, a series of chilling revelations began to emerge. It was discovered that Lucia had been in contact with a man named Juan Carlos Lopez, a local criminal with a history of violent offenses. Lopez had a reputation for preying on vulnerable women, and his name quickly came to the attention of investigators. As the investigation continued, the police uncovered more unsettling details about Lopez's past. He had been previously arrested for similar crimes, including assault and harassment, but had managed to avoid serving significant time behind bars due to technicalities in the legal system. His reputation in the community was that of a dangerous and unpredictable individual, known for his violent temper and erratic behavior. In the days before Lucia's death, Lopez had been seen in the same area where she had been socializing with her friends, sparking suspicions among the police. The police were able to track down Lopez, who initially denied any involvement in the crime. He claimed that he had been nowhere near the river on the night of Lucia's death. However, the investigators found evidence that contradicted his alibi. Surveillance footage from nearby security cameras revealed that Lopez had been in the vicinity of the river on the night Lucia disappeared. The police also discovered that his phone records showed that he had been in contact with Lucia shortly before her death. With this new evidence, the investigators arrested Lopez on suspicion of murder. He was taken into custody, and the authorities began to build their case against him. As the investigation progressed, it was revealed that Lopez had a disturbing history of targeting young women, and many of his victims had been too afraid to come forward. The authorities feared that Lucia might have been just another victim of his predatory behavior. Despite Lopez's attempts to deny his involvement, the evidence against him mounted. Forensic experts confirmed that DNA samples found on Lucia's clothing matched Lopez's, further strengthening the case against him. He was eventually charged with murder, and the trial began in late 2013. The case of Lucia Perez became a symbol of the larger issue of gender-based violence in Argentina. Her tragic death highlighted the dangers faced by women in the country, where femicides and violent crimes against women have been a long-standing problem. It also shed light on the failures of the justice system which had allowed a dangerous criminal like Lopez to evade proper punishment for his previous crimes. The case sparked protests across the country, with thousands of people demanding justice for Lucia and calling for stricter laws to protect women from violence. As the trial of Juan Carlos Lopez progressed, the public's interest in the case grew. The media closely followed every development, and the court proceedings became a focal point for debates about gender violence and the legal system's handling of such cases. The outcome of the trial was eagerly awaited, with many hoping that justice would be served for Lucia and her grieving family. Though the investigation was still ongoing, the case of Lucia Perez in 2013 would go down in history as one of the most tragic and controversial criminal cases in Argentina, forever changing the discourse around femicide and the treatment of women in the country. The arrest of Juan Carlos Lopez sparked a media frenzy across Argentina. People from all walks of life were deeply affected by the brutality of the crime and the revelations about Lopez's history. As the case unfolded, the Argentine public was forced to confront the ongoing issue of gender-based violence, which had long been a pervasive problem in the country. Lucia Perez's death became a symbol of the many women who suffered in silence, victims of a system that had repeatedly failed to protect them. Lopez's trial began in late 2013, under the scrutiny of both the local media and human rights organizations. The prosecution's case was built on a combination of physical evidence, witness testimonies, and Lopez's own inconsistent statements. The most damning evidence against him was the DNA match found on Lucia's clothes, as well as the surveillance footage showing him near the river where her body was discovered. Furthermore, the phone records and the testimony of several witnesses placed him in direct contact with Lucia on the night she was last seen alive. The trial exposed the terrifying details of Lopez's violent past. His history of abuse and criminal activity was no longer a secret. It came to light that he had a long history of preying on young women, although many of his earlier victims had either not reported the assaults or had been too afraid to testify against him. It was revealed that Lopez had been previously arrested on multiple occasions, but due to legal loopholes, he had managed to evade severe punishment. His history of violence, combined with the shocking nature of Lucia's murder, painted a portrait of a dangerous and unrepentant criminal who had slipped through the cracks of the justice system for years. As the trial continued, Lucia's family and supporters of gender rights took to the streets in large numbers to demand justice. They held vigils, marches, and protests, calling for an end to femicides and a more rigorous approach to protecting women from violence. Lucia's parents, devastated by their daughter's death, spoke publicly about their grief and their desire for justice. Her mother, in particular, became an outspoken advocate for women's rights, sharing her daughter's story to raise awareness of the dangers faced by women in Argentina and beyond. The case also sparked nationwide conversations about how society viewed and treated women. Many felt that Lucia's death was not an isolated incident, but a reflection of a much deeper societal problem, one rooted in misogyny, sexism, and institutional neglect. Activists and organizations that had been fighting for women's rights in Argentina for years saw Lucia's murder as a critical moment to bring attention to the epidemic of femicide. The term femicidio, used to describe the killing of a woman because of her gender, became a central topic in discussions around gender-based violence and women's rights in Argentina. In the midst of the growing protests and the media attention, the trial itself was a highly charged affair. Lopez, who had been arrested under the suspicion of murder, maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings. His defense team tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial and that there was no direct proof linking him to the murder. They attempted to shift the blame to other individuals, but their arguments were weak in comparison to the strong case presented by the prosecution. As the days went by, it became increasingly clear that Lopez was guilty of the crime he was accused of. The trial culminated in a conviction on December 15, 2013. Juan Carlos Lopez was found guilty of the brutal murder of Lucia Perez and was sentenced to life in prison. The conviction brought a sense of relief and a measure of justice to Lucia's family, though nothing could undo the pain of losing their beloved daughter. For her parents, the trial was a bitter reminder of their devastating loss, but it was also a step toward holding those who perpetrate such crimes accountable. It was a victory not just for Lucia's family, but for the countless women who have faced similar violence, and for the wider movement advocating for an end to gender-based violence. However, the trial did not end the conversation about femicide in Argentina. On the contrary, Lucia's case fueled a much larger national debate about the prevalence of gender-based violence and the failings of the legal system. In the wake of her death, and in the years following the trial, there were calls for stronger laws and more effective measures to protect women. Advocacy groups, including the feminist movement, pushed for the establishment of better resources for survivors of violence, as well as a reform of the judicial system to ensure that perpetrators of gender-based violence could not evade justice. Despite the conviction, many felt that the punishment handed down to Lopez was not enough to address the root causes of gender-based violence in Argentina. While life imprisonment may have offered some measure of justice, many argued that the real change needed to come in the form of systemic reforms. Activists called for more education, more awareness campaigns, and a broader cultural shift to address the deep-seated misogyny that contributed to such crimes. Lucia Perez's murder and the subsequent trial exposed the dark reality faced by women in Argentina and the larger global issue of gender violence. The case became a rallying cry for the many women who had suffered in silence for far too long. It was not just a tragedy for her family, but a tragedy for a nation that had failed to protect its women. The fight for justice did not end with Lopez's conviction. It was only just beginning. As Lucia's case remained in the public consciousness, the national conversation surrounding femicides grew louder. The Argentine government, pressured by public outcry, began to take steps toward addressing the issue more seriously. One of the most significant developments was the creation of a national registry for femicides, which was launched in 2015 to track and prevent such crimes. The movement also gained significant international attention, shedding light on the global issue of gender-based violence. For Lucia Perez's family, the pain of her loss would never fully go away. But they found strength in the fact that their daughter's death was not in vain. Lucia's tragic fate became a symbol of the fight for women's rights in Argentina, and her legacy continues to inspire the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. Lucia Perez's murder and the subsequent trial reverberated beyond Argentina, sparking a global conversation on gender-based violence, the systemic failures of the justice system, and the need for urgent reform. The case drew widespread attention to the issue of femicide, both in Argentina and in many parts of the world where women face similar threats of violence. Lucia's name became synonymous with the movement against gender-based violence, and her case was a defining moment for the feminist movement in Argentina. In the months following Lucia's death, public demonstrations continued across the country. One of the most significant events was the Ni Una Menos, Not One Less movement, which gained immense momentum after Lucia's murder. Ni Una Menos became a rallying cry for thousands of women who were fed up with the continued violence against women and the failure of the state to protect them. The movement advocated for stronger laws, better resources for survivors of violence, and a cultural shift to end gender discrimination and violence. The first major demonstration of the Ni Una Menos movement occurred in June 2015, when women from across Argentina took to the streets to demand justice for Lucia and all victims of femicide. The protest was a huge success, with millions of people participating across various cities in Argentina. The movement was not only a response to Lucia's death, but to the rising tide of femicides in the country. Statistics show that, in the year following her death, the number of femicides in Argentina remained alarmingly high. According to reports, at least one woman was killed every 30 hours due to gender-based violence. The Ni Una Menos movement was pivotal in pushing the Argentine government to adopt stronger measures against gender-based violence. It created a wave of public support for legal reforms, pushing lawmakers to amend the criminal code to address femicide specifically as a crime. In 2015, the Argentine Congress passed a law that declared femicide a specific criminal offense. The law also introduced harsher penalties for those convicted of gender-based violence, recognizing it as a serious societal issue. This was a major victory for the movement, but it also highlighted the work that still needed to be done in terms of implementation, education, and cultural change. Lucia's murder also sparked international attention to the broader issue of femicide and the inequality women face. In many countries around the world, similar cases of gender-based violence continued to unfold, often with little consequence for the perpetrators. Lucia's case became a touchstone for global feminist movements, and her story was shared in solidarity by women's rights groups in Latin America, Europe, and beyond. In many ways, her death transcended national borders, becoming part of a larger call for global recognition and action against gender violence. In Argentina, the focus on legal reforms continued in the years following Lucia's murder. The National Registry of Femicides, established in 2015, tracked cases of femicide and helped raise awareness about the true scale of gender violence in the country. The law also mandated that police officers undergo training to better understand and respond to cases of gender-based violence. These initiatives, while important, were not without their challenges. Activists and survivors continued to point out the inadequacies in the system and the lack of resources for women who were victims of violence. Despite these challenges, there were some signs of progress. Public campaigns, including national media coverage of cases like Lucia's, helped to keep the issue of gender violence in the public eye. The work of organizations like unwind and other feminist groups continued to make a significant impact, and the conversation surrounding the role of the state, society, and the justice system in addressing femicides became a permanent part of national discourse. In 2016, the Argentine government created a national hotline for women experiencing violence, providing an important tool for those seeking help. As the years went by, Lucia Perez's case remained an emotional touchstone for the families of femicide victims and those fighting for women's rights. Her parents continued to advocate for justice, both for their daughter and for all women whose voices were silenced by violence. They were frequently involved in marches and public demonstrations, speaking at events organized by the feminist movement. Lucia's mother, in particular, became an outspoken figure in the fight against femicide, regularly meeting with lawmakers and leaders to discuss further measures that could be taken to protect women from violence. In addition to the legal and social impact, Lucia's case also had profound personal implications for her family. Her parents, although devastated by their loss, found strength in the ongoing fight for justice. They channeled their grief into advocacy, determined to ensure that their daughter's death would not be in vain. For them, the conviction of Juan Carlos Lopez brought some sense of closure, though the emotional toll of their loss would never be fully healed. Their involvement in public discussions and protests in the aftermath of Lucia's death served as a reminder of the importance of family in seeking justice and accountability. Lucia Perez's murder and the subsequent trial represented a turning point in Argentina's approach to gender-based violence. While much work remained to be done in terms of cultural change, legal reform, and support systems for women, the case sparked a national conversation about women's rights, justice, and the need for better protection against violence. It was also a rallying point for survivors and activists who continued to fight for a world where women could live free from the fear of violence. Lucia's legacy lives on in the countless women who have found strength and solidarity through the unwind movement and other feminist initiatives. Her case was tragic, but it became a symbol of resistance against injustice and a beacon of hope for those working toward a society where gender-based violence is eradicated. As Argentina continues to confront its issues with femicide, Lucia Perez's memory serves as a reminder of the power of collective action and the importance of never giving up in the fight for justice. Let's jump to next story. Story 2. In 2013, Argentina was rocked by a brutal crime that would capture the attention of the nation and beyond. The case involved the tragic death of a 17-year-old boy named Kevin Molina. What began as a seemingly ordinary life for a teenager in the outskirts of Buenos Aires quickly spiraled into a nightmare, one that would expose the harsh realities of gang violence and the often unchecked power of criminal organizations in the country. Kevin Molina, a young and promising teenager, lived in a modest neighborhood in the outskirts of Buenos Aires. Kevin was known for his outgoing personality and his love for playing soccer with his friends. Despite the rough conditions of his neighborhood, he had big dreams of becoming a professional soccer player one day. He worked hard and maintained strong bonds with his family, often spending time with his younger siblings and helping his parents with daily chores. On the evening of May 3, 2013, Kevin went out to meet his friends at a local park. It was a regular Friday evening, and he had planned to hang out and enjoy a few hours with his friends before returning home for the night. However, that evening would mark the end of his young life. Around midnight, Kevin was seen talking to a group of older teenagers in the park. Unbeknownst to him, this seemingly innocent encounter would lead to his death. The group of older boys was affiliated with a local gang that had been involved in illegal activities, including drug trafficking, extortion, and violent crimes. The gang had a reputation for bullying local residents and forcing young people into their criminal activities. At some point during the conversation, a heated argument broke out between Kevin and one of the gang members. According to witnesses, the argument escalated quickly. The gang member, who was in his 20s, allegedly accused Kevin of disrespecting him, though the exact details of the altercation remain unclear. Some witnesses claimed that Kevin had refused to join the gang's activities, while others suggested that it was simply a matter of pride or a personal insult. Whatever the cause, the argument quickly became violent. The situation took a dark turn when one of the gang members pulled out a weapon. The group, now enraged, began to surround Kevin. Despite his attempts to flee, he was trapped by the gang members who had cornered him in the park. They began to assault him, beating him severely before the final blow came. Kevin was shot multiple times, and his body was left abandoned in the park, a few meters from where the altercation had taken place. The murder was brutal and senseless, but it was not an isolated incident. Gang violence had been a growing issue in the area for years, with rival groups fighting for control over the local drug trade. However, what made Kevin's case particularly shocking was the apparent randomness of his murder. The young boy had no previous criminal involvement, nor was he known to have any enemies. His death was an example of the violence that often claimed innocent lives in Argentina's most marginalized neighborhoods, where young people were often forced to become entangled in criminal activities just to survive. The news of Kevin Molina's murder spread quickly through the local community, and soon it caught the attention of the wider public. His death highlighted the ongoing issue of gang violence in the country, a problem that had been simmering for years, but had not received adequate attention from authorities. Local media outlets reported extensively on the murder, describing Kevin as a promising young teenager whose life was taken far too soon. His family, devastated by the loss, began to speak out publicly, demanding justice for their son and hoping to raise awareness about the dangers of gang violence in their community. As police began their investigation into the murder, they faced significant challenges. The local gang that had been involved in Kevin's death was notoriously difficult to infiltrate. Many members had ties to the drug trade, and they operated in a tight-knit network that was difficult for law enforcement to crack. Witnesses were hesitant to come forward, fearful of retaliation from the gang members. Despite this, the authorities worked tirelessly, hoping to gather enough evidence to bring Kevin's killers to justice. The investigation revealed several key pieces of evidence. Witnesses were eventually able to provide descriptions of the individuals who had been involved in the attack. Surveillance footage from nearby buildings showed a group of men leaving the park shortly after the shooting. This footage, along with physical evidence found at the crime scene, gave police a clearer picture of the individuals responsible. However, it was not enough to make an arrest immediately. The police also learned that Kevin had been in contact with several local youths who were either directly or indirectly affiliated with the gang. Investigators began to piece together a picture of Kevin's life, finding that he had been offered a position within the gang at some point in the past. However, Kevin had reportedly refused, not wanting to get involved in their criminal activities. This refusal, authorities believed, may have contributed to his murder, as the gang likely saw it as an affront to their authority. As the investigation continued, tensions within the neighborhood began to rise. The community, already grappling with high levels of violence and poverty, demanded swift action from law enforcement. Local activists, alongside Kevin's grieving family, organized protests calling for stronger measures to combat gang violence and to hold those responsible for Kevin's death accountable. The protests gained momentum, with more and more residents joining in, all calling for an end to the fear and intimidation that gangs had brought to their community. The case became a symbol of the growing crisis in Argentina's marginalized communities, where gang violence had become a deadly reality for many young people. Kevin's murder highlighted the dangers faced by teenagers who lived in areas where gangs controlled the streets and where criminal activity was often normalized. As public pressure mounted, the authorities knew that they could not afford to let this case slip through the cracks. The investigation into Kevin Molina's murder continued into the following weeks, with detectives working around the clock to identify and apprehend the individuals responsible. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, and a clearer picture of the events leading up to the murder emerged. However, the road to justice would be long and fraught with challenges. The truth about what happened that night was yet to be fully revealed, and the community was still reeling from the shock of the crime. As the investigation into Kevin Molina's murder progressed, the authorities faced mounting pressure to solve the case and bring the perpetrators to justice. The local community, devastated by the loss of the young teenager, demanded accountability. Local media outlets closely followed every new development, amplifying the voices of activists, community leaders, and the victim's family. Public outcry became a driving force for law enforcement, urging them to push forward with the case despite the challenges. One of the first major breakthroughs in the investigation came when police managed to obtain a partial identification of the suspects from local informants. These individuals, fearful of retribution from the gang members, were reluctant to speak out initially. However, over time, some witnesses came forward anonymously, providing key information that helped investigators piece together the events leading up to Kevin's death. Several witnesses confirmed that the group of individuals involved in the murder were part of a local gang, which had been known for its violent behavior and control over illicit activities in the area. This gang was infamous for its involvement in drug trafficking and its practice of coercing young people into participating in their criminal operations. Detectives also interviewed several people who had known Kevin personally. They learned that, although Kevin had never been involved in criminal activities, he had been approached by gang members multiple times in the past. They had offered him a position within their group, but Kevin had refused. He had reportedly told his friends that he wanted to pursue his dreams of becoming a professional soccer player and wanted nothing to do with the dangerous world of gang crime. This refusal to join the gang was a key turning point in the investigation, as it suggested that Kevin's death was likely a result of the gang's anger and perceived disrespect toward him. Another crucial piece of evidence came from surveillance footage taken from nearby shops and street cameras. The footage showed a group of men matching the descriptions provided by witnesses, walking away from the scene of the murder shortly after the shooting. The images were grainy, but they gave investigators a rough idea of the suspects' physical characteristics and clothing. The footage also showed the suspects lingering near the park just moments before the crime occurred. While the images were not enough to definitively identify the individuals involved, they served as an important clue for the authorities. In the weeks following the murder, detectives managed to narrow down the list of suspects. One of the gang members, identified as a man named Ariel Gonzalez, was quickly flagged as a primary suspect. Gonzalez, in his mid-20s, had a criminal record that included charges of assault and drug trafficking. He was known to have a violent temper, and it was believed that he had been one of the main individuals involved in the altercation that escalated into Kevin's murder. Gonzalez was reportedly a high-ranking member of the gang, and investigators learned that he had been seen with Kevin on the night of the murder, just before the argument began. On May 18, 2013, after nearly 2 weeks of gathering evidence and conducting interviews, police arrested Ariel Gonzalez in connection with Kevin Molina's death. Gonzalez was taken into custody at his home, where he was found hiding in a small apartment. He initially denied any involvement in the murder, claiming that he had not been near the park that night. However, the authorities had gathered enough physical evidence, including the surveillance footage and witness statements, to charge him with the crime. The arrest of Gonzalez was a critical moment in the investigation. However, the police were not yet finished. Investigators soon turned their attention to several other individuals connected to the gang, as it was clear that Kevin's murder was the result of a coordinated effort by multiple people. Ariel Gonzalez, while identified as a key player in the attack, was believed to have had accomplices. Some of the other gang members were said to have played a role in restraining Kevin and participating in the physical assault that preceded the fatal shooting. The police quickly moved to arrest additional members of the gang who had been involved in the murder. Among the suspects was another man named Christian Diaz, who had been a close associate of Gonzalez. Diaz had been seen arguing with Kevin just before the shooting took place, and witnesses identified him as one of the individuals who had physically attacked the teenager. Diaz was arrested in early June 2013 and was charged with assault and accessory to murder. As the arrests piled up, more details about the gang's operations came to light. Investigators uncovered evidence that the gang had been heavily involved in the local drug trade, using violence and intimidation to maintain control over the area. They had recruited young people like Kevin to serve as couriers, pushing them into criminal activity under the threat of violence. This brutal tactic, which involved coercing vulnerable youths into doing the gang's bidding, was a pattern that had been repeated time and again across various neighborhoods in Buenos Aires. By the summer of 2013, the authorities had arrested a total of 6 individuals connected to Kevin Molina's murder. The investigation revealed a web of criminal activity, with links to drug trafficking, extortion, and other violent crimes. The arrests were a small victory for the police, who had long struggled to control gang activity in the area. However, there was still much work to be done. As the trial date approached, the question of how to address the systemic issues that allowed gang violence to thrive remained at the forefront of public discussion. Kevin Molina's family, though still grieving the loss of their son, found solace in the fact that those responsible for his death were being held accountable. They continued to speak out publicly, attending rallies and meetings with officials to push for greater efforts to combat gang violence in Argentina's underprivileged neighborhoods. Their advocacy, along with the pressure from local residents and activists, played a pivotal role in keeping the issue of gang violence on the national agenda. The case also highlighted the need for deeper reforms in Argentina's justice system. Despite the arrests and the eventual trial, many believed that gang violence would continue to thrive unless the root causes of the problem, poverty, lack of education, and limited opportunities for young people, were addressed. As the trial approached, the hope was that Kevin Molina's case would be a turning point in the fight against gang violence in Argentina. As the trial for the murder of Kevin Molina began in 2014, the case became a significant moment in Argentina's fight against gang violence and the growing influence of organized crime in marginalized neighborhoods. The proceedings were closely watched by the public and the media, with many hoping that the case would bring a sense of justice for Kevin and highlight the need for greater attention to the country's gang violence problem. The trial saw several of the arrested individuals stand before the court, facing charges related to Kevin's murder. Ariel Gonzalez, Christian Diaz, and 4 other gang members were named as primary suspects. The prosecution's case was built on the evidence gathered by the police, including surveillance footage, witness testimony, and the confessions of some of the gang members who had been arrested. The evidence provided a clear picture of what had transpired on the night of Kevin's murder and placed the suspects at the scene of the crime. During the trial, Ariel Gonzalez, the gang leader, was accused of being the one who had pulled the trigger, fatally shooting Kevin after the heated argument escalated. Gonzalez's defense attorneys argued that the evidence was circumstantial and questioned the reliability of some of the witnesses. They claimed that there was no direct evidence linking him to the fatal shot and suggested that other members of the gang could have been responsible. However, the prosecution maintained that Gonzalez was the mastermind behind the crime, using his position of power in the gang to orchestrate the attack. The trial also revealed the culture of fear and intimidation that had kept the community silent for so long. Several witnesses who had initially been hesitant to come forward were eventually able to testify, explaining the pressure they had felt to remain silent out of fear of retaliation from the gang. Some witnesses had provided information anonymously, fearful that speaking out publicly would put their lives in danger. The courage of those who testified played a crucial role in ensuring that the case proceeded, despite the overwhelming fear that permeated the community. As the trial progressed, more disturbing details about the gang's operations emerged. Evidence showed that the gang had been involved in a variety of illegal activities, including drug trafficking, extortion, and the recruitment of young people to act as drug couriers. Many young people, like Kevin, had been coerced into joining the gang or were intimidated into silence when they refused. This pattern of exploitation and violence became a key focus of the prosecution, highlighting the broader issue of how young people in impoverished neighborhoods were often drawn into dangerous and illegal activities. The trial also brought to light the limited resources and opportunities available to the youth in the affected neighborhoods. Kevin's tragic death was emblematic of a larger social crisis in Argentina, where young people living in poverty often found themselves with few options beyond joining gangs. The lack of access to education, employment, and social services made it difficult for many young people to escape the cycle of violence and crime that plagued their communities. Kevin, who had dreamed of becoming a professional soccer player, was one of many who faced the impossible choice between pursuing a better future and succumbing to the pressures of gangs that offered a sense of belonging and, at times, economic gain. The trial also became a platform for the Molina family to speak out about their personal loss and the need for change. Kevin's mother, Maria Molina, became a vocal advocate for justice and for stronger measures to combat gang violence. She expressed her grief publicly, but also her determination to ensure that Kevin's death would not be in vain. She joined forces with local activists and community leaders to push for more effective policies to protect young people from being drawn into gang life. Maria's advocacy was supported by organizations that focused on fighting organized crime and protecting the rights of young people, and her tireless efforts brought much-needed attention to the larger issue of gang violence in Argentina. In the end, the court convicted Ariel Gonzalez of first-degree murder and sentenced him to life in prison. Christian Diaz, along with several other members of the gang, was also found guilty of participating in the crime and received various sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years in prison. The sentences were seen as a partial victory, but they also highlighted the larger issue of gang violence in Argentina. For many, the conviction of the perpetrators did little to address the systemic issues that allowed gangs to thrive in the first place. While the trial was a critical step toward justice for Kevin Molina and his family, it was also a reminder of the persistent social problems that contributed to his death. The gang that took his life was not an isolated case. It was part of a broader trend of rising violence among Argentina's youth. The sentencing of the gang members provided some sense of closure for Kevin's family, but it also reinforced the need for comprehensive reforms to prevent further violence and protect vulnerable communities. In the years following the trial, the case of Kevin Molina remained a symbol of the fight against gang violence in Argentina. Activists and organizations continued to push for stronger policies aimed at curbing organized crime and providing young people with better opportunities to escape the grip of gangs. The case also sparked debates about the need for greater investment in education, job training, and social services for disadvantaged communities. Kevin's death served as a catalyst for increased awareness of the challenges faced by young people living in poverty-stricken areas, and it led to renewed calls for government action. The Argentine government, under mounting pressure from civil society, began to implement programs aimed at tackling youth violence, but many believed that more needed to be done to address the root causes of the problem, such as the lack of social and economic opportunities in vulnerable neighborhoods. Kevin Molina's murder left a lasting impact on his family, his community, and the nation. While his death was a heartbreaking tragedy, it ultimately helped bring attention to a pressing issue that had long been ignored. His legacy lives on through the efforts of those who continue to fight for justice, for the prevention of gang violence, and for a better future for young people in Argentina. Let's jump to next story. Story 3. In October 2013, the city of Mar del Plata, Argentina, was deeply affected by an incident that would capture the attention of the entire nation and raise serious concerns about violence against women. The victim was Lucia Perez, a 16-year-old girl whose life was tragically taken in a way that would highlight serious issues within Argentine society regarding gender-based violence. Lucia Perez was a young teenager full of potential. She lived in Mar del Plata and was well-liked in her community. Known for her friendly demeanor, she had dreams of pursuing a future in healthcare. Lucia had a supportive family and was a dedicated student, attending school regularly and actively engaging in her studies. She was also passionate about spending time with friends and family, and her loved ones described her as a caring and optimistic person. Like many adolescents, she was looking forward to the future and the opportunities life would bring. On October 8, 2013, Lucia had been out running errands in her neighborhood, and after a brief visit to a local store, she planned to meet her friends. During this time, she was followed by two individuals, later identified as Matias Farias and Juan Pablo Galvin. Both men were known to the local authorities and had histories linked to criminal behavior, including involvement with illicit substances. Unfortunately, their encounter with Lucia would soon escalate into a devastating act. Lucia was approached by the two men in an isolated area as she was walking through a quiet street. It was at this point that the situation turned violent. According to the findings later presented in the investigation, the men took Lucia to a nearby, secluded location. There, they proceeded to harm her in ways that caused great distress. Lucia was left in this location, and her body was found not long after. Her family, who were initially unaware of what had transpired, soon became concerned when Lucia did not return home. As time passed, they reached out to the authorities, who began searching for her. Tragically, the discovery of her body confirmed their worst fears. The news of Lucia's death spread rapidly through the town, and her family was left devastated by the loss. The local police immediately began their investigation. Thanks to the cooperation of local witnesses and the available forensic evidence, the authorities quickly focused on Farias and Galvin as key suspects. Items found at the scene and forensic analysis, including DNA samples, helped build the case against them. The investigation revealed a pattern of criminal activity tied to the suspects, making it clear that their actions had led to the untimely death of a young girl. As the investigation progressed, public outcry over Lucia's death grew louder. The brutality of the crime shocked the nation, but it also raised critical questions about the safety of women, particularly young women in the country. The case quickly became emblematic of a larger issue of violence against women in Argentina, where many women and girls faced varying degrees of harm. Lucia's family, along with various advocacy groups, began to call for justice, demanding that the individuals responsible for the crime be held accountable. The loss of Lucia Perez brought attention not only to the immediate crime, but also to the broader issue of femicide, a term used to describe the gender-based killing of women. Argentina, like many countries, had been grappling with the rising number of femicides, where women were subjected to violence by those close to them or strangers. Lucia's death became a rallying point for feminist organizations, human rights groups, and concerned citizens, who called for more efforts to prevent such crimes and improve the response of the justice system. In the days following the discovery of Lucia's body, protests erupted across Argentina, with people taking to the streets to demand justice for Lucia and other women who had been victims of violence. These protests became a crucial moment for the country, as they highlighted the urgent need for action on issues related to gender-based violence, public safety, and the protection of women's rights. As the investigation continued, it became clear that the crime was not an isolated incident, but part of a troubling trend. The murder of Lucia Perez was a painful reminder of the dangers women and girls face, particularly in situations where they are vulnerable. The event also emphasized the need for systemic change in addressing the root causes of violence and inequality. Despite the tragedy of Lucia's death, her story sparked important conversations about the treatment of women in society. Her family, especially her mother, became active advocates for justice, calling for reforms to better protect women from violence. They worked alongside various activists and organizations to ensure that Lucia's case would lead to meaningful changes in Argentina's approach to addressing violence against women. The brutal murder of Lucia Perez in 2013 prompted an immediate and intense investigation by the authorities, who worked tirelessly to identify the perpetrators and bring them to justice. As the investigation unfolded, the details of the crime and the perpetrators' involvement began to emerge, shocking both the local community and the nation as a whole. What followed was not just a criminal case, but a national conversation about the safety of women, gender-based violence, and the need for stronger protections. The police initially focused on collecting forensic evidence from the scene of the crime. Lucia's body was found in an abandoned building, and the investigators discovered DNA evidence that linked the two suspects, Matias Farias and Juan Pablo Galvan, to the scene. The authorities were able to trace their movements through surveillance footage from nearby stores and public cameras, which showed the suspects following Lucia before the crime occurred. This surveillance footage was a crucial piece of evidence, as it confirmed the presence of the two men in the area at the time of Lucia's disappearance. Over the next few days, the police collected further information about the suspects' backgrounds. Matias Farias had a history of criminal activity, including previous charges related to assault. His criminal record raised immediate concerns about the nature of his involvement in the crime. Juan Pablo Galvan, on the other hand, had a history of minor offenses, but he had been seen in the area around the time of Lucia's disappearance. Both men were questioned by the police, and their statements were inconsistent with the evidence. The detectives quickly pieced together the details of what had happened in the hours leading up to Lucia's death. Witnesses from the area where Lucia had been last seen came forward, providing descriptions of the men. These witnesses reported seeing Farias and Galvan walking with Lucia in a secluded part of town, but no one had intervened, as the area was not heavily trafficked at that hour. Many in the community were afraid to speak out, as gang activity and crime were known to be a problem in the area. However, some witnesses, despite their fear of retribution, came forward, providing the authorities with important information that helped build the case. As more evidence was gathered, the public learned of the disturbing nature of the crime. Lucia had been subjected to physical violence before her death, and the investigation revealed that the attackers had been involved in sexual assault. This fact further fueled the outrage of the public and human rights organizations, who were already concerned about the high number of femicides occurring in the country. The case of Lucia Perez quickly became a symbol of the broader issue of gender-based violence in Argentina. In response to the crime, there was a large outpouring of public grief and anger. Protests began to form across Argentina, with many people demanding justice for Lucia and other women who had been victims of similar violence. The protests were organized by various women's rights groups, feminist organizations, and community leaders who had long been advocating for stronger protections against gender-based violence. These protests drew attention to the need for systemic change in how the government and justice system dealt with femicides and violence against women. The slogan "En hay una menos," not one less, became widely used during these protests, calling for an end to violence against women and girls in Argentina. The public reaction to Lucia's death was not just about justice for her, but a demand for a broader cultural shift. People were calling for better education about gender equality, improved legal protections, and a response to the social factors that contributed to such violence. It was clear that the murder of Lucia Perez was part of a much larger problem in Argentine society, where women and girls were often subjected to abuse, neglect, and violence. Lucia's family, especially her mother, Maria Perez, became vocal advocates for justice. Maria Perez spoke out publicly, demanding accountability for those responsible for her daughter's death. She also became an advocate for other women who had been victims of violence. In her public appearances, Maria called on the Argentine government to implement stronger laws to protect women and ensure that perpetrators of violence were held accountable. She, along with many others, pushed for reforms that would help prevent future violence and provide better support for victims and their families. The outcry in response to Lucia's death led to calls for more effective police training and increased resources for law enforcement. Activists and human rights organizations pointed out that many women in Argentina did not report violence because they did not trust the police to take their complaints seriously or because they feared retaliation. The justice system's response to violence against women was also questioned, as there were concerns that perpetrators of gender-based violence were not always held accountable for their actions. The case of Lucia Perez exposed these shortcomings and highlighted the need for reform. At the same time, the public's response also drew attention to the lack of education on issues related to gender, consent, and respect in Argentina. Many activists emphasized the importance of starting conversations about these topics at an early age, so that future generations would grow up understanding the value of treating women with dignity and respect. This shift in public consciousness was seen as crucial to addressing the root causes of violence and creating a safer society for women and girls. By the end of 2013, the investigation was moving toward the prosecution phase. Farias and Galvin were formally charged with the murder of Lucia Perez, as well as other related crimes. They both denied involvement in the crime, but the evidence against them was overwhelming. Prosecutors built their case around the physical evidence found at the scene, including DNA samples, as well as witness testimonies and surveillance footage. The trial would soon take place, but the emotional impact of Lucia's death had already begun to resonate across the nation. The case of Lucia Perez did not just change the lives of her family, it had a lasting effect on Argentine society as a whole. It helped bring the issue of femicide to the forefront of the national conversation, compelling the government to take a more active role in addressing violence against women. Lucia's story became a rallying point for reform, as citizens, activists, and organizations came together to demand change. The trial of Matias Farias and Juan Pablo Galvin, the men accused of the brutal murder of Lucia Perez, marked a pivotal moment in Argentina's ongoing fight against femicide and violence against women. The case continued to draw intense public attention, with a collective demand for justice not only for Lucia, but also for the countless other women who had suffered similar fates. The trial became a symbol of the larger issue of gender-based violence in the country, which had reached alarming levels. The legal proceedings began in 2014, with both Farias and Galvin facing multiple charges related to Lucia's murder. The prosecution's case was built on the overwhelming evidence gathered by the police during the investigation. Forensic analysis, including DNA evidence, placed both men at the scene of the crime. Additionally, surveillance footage from nearby businesses showed the suspects following Lucia before the attack, providing a clear timeline of events. Witnesses who had seen the men in the area also testified, further corroborating the evidence against them. The prosecution painted a clear picture of the crime. Lucia was followed by Farias and Galvin as she walked home, then subjected to extreme violence in an isolated location. The charges against the men included aggravated sexual assault and homicide. The brutal nature of the crime shocked the public and made it a high-profile case that would put the spotlight on the Argentine legal system's handling of gender-based violence. Throughout the trial, both men maintained their innocence, though their defense was widely criticized as lacking credibility. Farias and Galvin claimed that they had no involvement in Lucia's death, but the mounting evidence contradicted their assertions. The defense sought to cast doubt on the forensic evidence and questioned the reliability of the testimonies presented by witnesses. However, the evidence was compelling, and it became increasingly clear that both men were responsible for the tragic death of Lucia Perez. One of the most significant aspects of the trial was the public and emotional involvement of Lucia's family, particularly her mother, Maria Perez. Throughout the legal process, Maria remained steadfast in her pursuit of justice for her daughter. She attended every court session, and her words in the media resonated deeply with the public. Maria spoke passionately about her daughter's life and the pain she felt from the loss. She emphasized the need for stronger measures to protect women and girls from violence, and she vowed to continue fighting for justice in honor of Lucia. In addition to her efforts in seeking justice for Lucia, Maria also became an advocate for broader reforms in Argentine society. She and other activists pushed for better laws to address gender-based violence, as well as greater resources for law enforcement to tackle such crimes. Maria's public advocacy and the media attention surrounding Lucia's case helped keep the issue of femicide in the national conversation, highlighting the need for comprehensive change in the country's approach to gender-based violence. The case also sparked a nationwide conversation about the importance of education and cultural change in addressing the root causes of violence against women. Many activists and organizations called for more extensive public education campaigns about respect, gender equality, and consent. They argued that systemic changes were needed, not just in the legal system, but also in the way society viewed and treated women. The murder of Lucia Perez was a stark reminder of the dangers faced by women, particularly young women, and the need for a cultural shift to ensure their safety and dignity. After a lengthy trial, the court delivered its verdict. Matias Farias was found guilty of the murder of Lucia Perez and sentenced to life in prison. Juan Pablo Galvin was also convicted of the same charges and received a sentence of 8 years in prison for his involvement in the crime. The sentencing was met with mixed reactions. While many felt that justice had been served in terms of holding the perpetrators accountable, others were dissatisfied with the perceived leniency of Galvin's sentence. Activists and members of Lucia's family expressed that the sentence did not adequately reflect the severity of the crime, particularly given the brutal nature of the attack. The trial's outcome brought some closure to Lucia's family, but it also highlighted the broader issue of how Argentina addresses gender-based violence. While the legal system had taken steps to hold the men accountable, many felt that more needed to be done to prevent such crimes in the first place. The case underscored the challenges of creating meaningful change in a society where violence against women had become tragically commonplace. Lucia's murder had a lasting impact on Argentine society. Her case was a catalyst for further activism, sparking public demonstrations and calls for legal reforms to better protect women. The Ni Una Menos movement, which had gained momentum after her death, continued to grow in strength, becoming one of the largest and most vocal movements against femicide in Latin America. It was not just about Lucia's case, but about creating a future where no woman or girl would have to fear for her safety. In the aftermath of Lucia's death, the Argentine government took some steps to address the issue of femicide and gender-based violence. Efforts included the creation of a national registry for femicides, better funding for support services for victims of violence, and improvements to the justice system's handling of such cases. These changes were seen as a positive development, but many advocates emphasized that much more work remained to be done. They argued that stronger laws, better enforcement, and a shift in societal attitudes toward women were essential to prevent future tragedies. Lucia Perez's death may have been a heartbreaking event, but her legacy has become a symbol of the ongoing fight for justice and gender equality in Argentina. The tragedy of her death galvanized a nation, leading to significant conversations about how to better protect women and how to ensure that future generations could live free from the threat of violence. Her story continues to inspire countless individuals to speak out, to demand justice, and to work toward a safer, more just society for all. Let's jump to next story. Story 4. In 2014, Argentina was rocked by the tragic disappearance and murder of a 16-year-old girl named Angeles Rawson. Her case drew nationwide attention and sparked widespread media coverage, not only because of the brutal nature of the crime, but also due to the circumstances surrounding her disappearance and the investigation that followed. Angeles Rawson's tragic death would become a highly publicized case that highlighted serious issues of violence, safety, and the protection of young women in the country. Angeles Rawson was a typical teenager who lived with her family in the bustling capital of Buenos Aires. She was known for her love of art, her friendly nature, and her active participation in school activities. Angeles was close to her family, particularly her mother, who described her as a caring and energetic young woman. Angeles lived in an apartment building in the city, and like many teenagers, she had a busy schedule, balancing school with extracurricular activities and social events. Her future seemed full of possibilities, and she had dreams of pursuing a career in design or the arts. She was well liked by her peers, and always seemed to be full of life. On the morning of June 10, 2013, Angeles Rawson left her home in the Palermo neighborhood of Buenos Aires to go to school. It was a typical Monday, and there was nothing to suggest that anything unusual was going to happen. Angeles took her usual route, heading to the bus stop to make her way to school. But as the day wore on, her family grew concerned when she didn't return home as expected. At first, they thought she may have stayed with a friend or gotten caught up in some other activity, but by the evening, it became clear that something was terribly wrong. Angeles had vanished without a trace. Her family immediately contacted the police, and a massive search effort was launched. Over the next few days, authorities combed through the area and interviewed people who may have seen her. Despite their efforts, no solid leads emerged, and her disappearance remained a mystery. It wasn't until June 13, 2013, 3 days after she had gone missing, that the tragic truth began to surface. Angeles' body was discovered in a garbage dump located on the outskirts of the city. The discovery of her body was a heartbreaking blow to her family and to the entire community. The news of her death spread quickly through the media, with many in Argentina expressing shock and disbelief. Angeles' murder was not just another case of a missing teenager. It was a highly publicized and disturbing crime that involved a young girl being murdered and discarded in such a callous manner. The community rallied together to support her grieving family, and people across the country began to demand answers about how such a crime could happen and who was responsible. The discovery of Angeles' body marked the beginning of a complex and intense investigation. The police initially struggled to find solid evidence, but over time, they were able to piece together key information that would lead them to a suspect. Forensic evidence indicated that Angeles had been brutally attacked and murdered before her body was left in the garbage dump. Her injuries were consistent with a violent assault, and investigators quickly realized that she had been killed in the same building where she had lived. This information would set the stage for a shocking revelation about the true nature of the crime. As the investigation progressed, the police began to focus on a man named Jorge Mangieri, the building's superintendent where Angeles had lived. Mangieri, who was in charge of maintaining the building and ensuring the safety of its residents, had known Angeles and her family well. He had regular contact with the residents of the building and was responsible for the upkeep of the building's common areas. However, the investigation soon revealed that Mangieri's relationship with the Rawson family was far more complicated than initially thought. On June 14th, just 1 day after the discovery of Angeles' body, Jorge Mangieri was arrested by the police. He was questioned in connection with Angeles' death, and it soon became clear that he was the primary suspect in the case. Mangieri initially denied any involvement in the crime, claiming that he had no idea what had happened to Angeles. However, evidence began to mount against him. Witnesses reported seeing him in the building on the day that Angeles disappeared, and forensic evidence linked him to the crime scene. One of the most damning pieces of evidence came in the form of DNA samples found on Angeles' body, which matched Mangieri's. Furthermore, it was revealed that Mangieri had been involved in a number of previous criminal activities, though he had managed to evade serious consequences in the past. The authorities quickly built their case around these findings, leading to Mangieri's formal arrest and charges related to the kidnapping, rape, and murder of Angeles Rawson. The arrest of Jorge Mangieri shocked the community and the nation. Many residents of the building were left in disbelief, struggling to understand how someone they had known and trusted could be involved in such a heinous crime. The news of Mangieri's arrest sparked widespread outrage, with many demanding justice for Angelus and her family. The case also brought attention to issues of safety in residential buildings, where the trust placed in building staff members was called into question. The investigation into Angelus' murder revealed some chilling details about Maindry's behavior. It was discovered that he had been spying on the residents of the building, including Angelus, and had taken an inappropriate interest in her. Maindry's actions indicated that he had been grooming her for some time, and that he had been watching her before carrying out the crime. This revelation sent shockwaves through the community, as it became clear that Mangieri had been hiding his true nature behind the facade of a trusted building superintendent. As the investigation continued, it was determined that Mangieri had planned the crime in advance. He had lured Angelus into a trap by offering to help her with something in the building, only to violently assault and kill her. His motives for the crime were not immediately clear, but it appeared that he had been driven by a mix of obsession and anger. In the weeks that followed, further details about Maindry's past and his behavior were revealed, painting a disturbing picture of a man who had been able to maintain his position of trust despite his criminal tendencies. The tragic murder of Angelus Rawson and the subsequent trial of Jorge Mangieri marked a turning point in Argentina's fight against gender-based violence and highlighted the deep flaws in the country's legal and social systems. While the conviction of Mangieri brought some sense of justice for Angelus' family, it also exposed broader systemic issues that contributed to the crime and its aftermath. The case had a profound impact on the public consciousness and sparked significant conversations about the safety of women, the accountability of public officials, and the need for cultural change in Argentina. Following the conviction, many sectors of Argentine society began to push for stronger legal reforms and better protections for women, particularly in residential and urban environments. The public outcry over the way Mangieri, a trusted figure in the building, had been able to commit such a brutal crime led to calls for more rigorous background checks for people working in positions of trust, such as building superintendents, janitors, and caretakers. This case made it clear that positions of power, even seemingly harmless ones, could be exploited to commit serious crimes, and it was vital for society to be vigilant about who was allowed access to vulnerable individuals. The tragedy also shone a light on the broader issue of femicide and sexual violence in Argentina. While gender-based violence has long been a concern in the country, Angelus' case brought it to the forefront of national discourse. There was a growing realization that much more needed to be done to protect women and girls from violence and to ensure that perpetrators were held accountable. Many felt that the legal system was not doing enough to prevent such crimes, and this case became a rallying point for activists and organizations dedicated to fighting gender violence. In the wake of Angelus' death, there was a significant increase in activism focused on femicide and the broader issue of women's safety. One of the most notable outcomes of this activism was the continued growth of the unwind movement. This movement, which had been gaining momentum in Argentina prior to Angelus' murder, became an even more powerful force for change in the years that followed. Unwind, meaning not one less, called for an end to gender-based violence and femicide, and it became one of the largest and most influential feminist movements in Latin America. Through marches, protests, and advocacy, the movement demanded greater accountability from the justice system and the government, as well as increased resources for victims of violence. Angelus' murder became a symbol of the need for urgent action to combat violence against women in Argentina. It underscored the importance of not only prosecuting individual criminals, but also addressing the cultural and institutional factors that allowed such violence to persist. Activists argued that the murder was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of abuse and neglect that many women in Argentina and across Latin America faced on a daily basis. The case sparked public debates about toxic masculinity, the objectification of women, and the failure of the legal system to protect women from violence. The impact of Angelus' death also led to legislative changes in Argentina. In 2015, the Argentine government passed a new law aimed at improving protections for women who had been victims of violence. The law created a national registry of femicides and established a more comprehensive framework for addressing cases of gender-based violence. It also increased penalties for perpetrators of domestic violence and created new measures to protect victims. These reforms were seen as a positive step in the fight against gender-based violence, but many advocates stressed that there was still much more work to be done to ensure that the justice system was fully equipped to handle these cases and that prevention efforts were prioritized. One of the other major changes that came out of this case was the growing recognition of the importance of victim support services. The murder of Angelus Rawson prompted a re-evaluation of the available resources for women who had been victims of violence or were at risk. Advocates called for better training for law enforcement, more shelters and resources for victims, and greater awareness about the signs of abuse. The case made it clear that women often had to face not only the trauma of violence, but also the stigma and lack of support that came with it. In addition to these legislative and institutional changes, the case had a profound personal impact on Angela's family, particularly her mother, Maria Rawson. Maria became an outspoken advocate for women's rights and gender equality after her daughter's murder. She attended numerous protests and demonstrations and used her voice to call for justice, not just for her daughter, but for all victims of violence. Her determination to see justice served for Angelus resonated with many, and her efforts helped keep the issue of femicide in the national conversation. Maria's emotional testimony during the trial was a powerful reminder of the human toll of such crimes and the need for a justice system that genuinely protects women and girls. The impact of the case also extended beyond Argentina's borders, as it became part of a larger conversation about gender violence in Latin America. Countries throughout the region were grappling with similar issues, and Angelus' murder became an example of how even trusted individuals in positions of power could exploit their authority to commit horrific acts of violence. The case was widely discussed in international human rights circles, and it prompted global calls for better protection for women, particularly in Latin America, where femicide rates were high. Despite the conviction and the reforms that followed, the murder of Angelus Rawson served as a tragic reminder that violence against women is still pervasive in many societies, and that the fight for gender equality is far from over. The case underscored the importance of vigilance, activism, and systemic change to prevent future tragedies. It also highlighted the need for a cultural shift that ensures women and girls can live free from fear of violence, harassment, and exploitation. In the years following the case, the memory of Angelus Rawson continued to inspire those who were working toward a safer and more just society. Her death became a catalyst for lasting change, pushing Argentina to confront its challenges with regard to gender-based violence head-on. While the pain of her loss can never be erased, the steps taken in her memory, through legal reforms, activism, and public discourse, offered hope that future generations of women and girls might not have to face the same fate. Let's jump to next story. Story 5. In 2014, Argentina was shocked by the tragic case of Luciano Arruga, a 16-year-old boy whose mysterious disappearance and subsequent death brought to light the deeply rooted issues of police corruption, impunity, and injustice within the country's law enforcement system. His case became emblematic of the violence faced by young people in marginalized neighborhoods, particularly in the slums surrounding Buenos Aires, where many youth were victims of police brutality and systemic discrimination. Luciano Arruga was a teenager from the working-class neighborhood of Lomas del Mirador, located in the western part of Buenos Aires. He lived with his mother, his 2 younger sisters, and his aunt. Luciano was described by his family and friends as a kind and good-hearted boy. He had a passion for soccer, enjoyed spending time with his friends, and had dreams of a better future despite the tough conditions in which he lived. His family lived in poverty, like many others in the area, but they tried to make do with what they had. For Luciano, life in the neighborhood was difficult, but he was just a normal teenager trying to find his way. On January 31st, 2009, Luciano went missing after leaving his house. His family last saw him in the early evening, when he told his mother he was going out to buy something. He was never seen again. At first, his family believed he had simply run away, or that he had gotten into some kind of trouble with friends. However, as days turned into weeks, the fear and anxiety of his family grew. The police were contacted, but their response was slow, and they seemed uninterested in investigating his disappearance. For the family, it was the beginning of a long and painful journey filled with frustration and disbelief. Despite repeated efforts to find Luciano, the police failed to take any substantial action. The investigation into his disappearance was lethargic, and his case seemed to be treated as just another missing persons report with little urgency. This indifference from law enforcement was particularly troubling for Luciano's mother, who felt that the police had already made up their minds about her son. At the time, the family had been living in a neighborhood that had a history of tension with the police. The area was notorious for being a hotspot of gang activity, drug use, and general poverty, and many young people in the community had been targeted by the police. However, it was clear that the police were not particularly interested in helping a poor teenager from this neighborhood. Months passed, and the search for Luciano went cold. His family kept fighting for answers, but the authorities were not forthcoming. It wasn't until years later, in 2014, that the truth about Luciano's death began to come to light, uncovering a chilling story of police corruption, abuse of power, and a system that failed to protect its most vulnerable citizens. In early 2014, after a lengthy investigation, new evidence came to light that would change the course of the case. It was revealed that Luciano Arruga had been seen by witnesses in the custody of local police officers shortly before his disappearance. These witnesses claimed that Luciano had been detained by police officers in the days before he vanished, and that they had seen him being taken into a police car. This revelation shocked Luciano's family and the public, as it became increasingly clear that the police had been involved in his disappearance. Further investigation into the circumstances surrounding his death uncovered disturbing evidence of police involvement. It was revealed that, at the time of Luciano's disappearance, several officers from the local police station were engaged in corrupt activities, including extortion and illegal detention. Some of the police officers were accused of using the young residents of the neighborhood as informants, coercing them into providing information about their peers in exchange for protection or, in some cases, money. It was soon discovered that Luciano had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that he had fallen victim to the police officers who had arrested him without cause. As it turned out, Luciano's arrest was not an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of abuse that the police had been perpetrating against young people in the area. Over the years, many reports had surfaced about the police harassing, threatening, and even killing young people who lived in poverty-stricken neighborhoods. Luciano's case was not unique. He had simply become one of the many victims of police violence and impunity. In fact, it was later revealed that Luciano's death had been covered up by the police, and they had intentionally withheld information from his family. For years, the authorities had refused to investigate properly, and no one had been held accountable for Luciano's death. However, after the new evidence came to light, pressure began to mount on the Argentine justice system to take action. Protests erupted in the streets, and human rights organizations began calling for an investigation into police abuse and corruption. Luciano's family, led by his mother, became vocal advocates for justice. They demanded that the police officers responsible for Luciano's death be brought to trial and that the truth about what had happened to their son be revealed. In 2014, after years of silence and indifference from the authorities, the Argentine justice system began to take action. A team of human rights lawyers took up the case, and the investigation into Luciano's death was reopened. With the help of new evidence, it was determined that Luciano had been detained by police officers shortly before his death, and that he had been tortured and killed. His body was eventually found in a remote area, discarded as if he were just another nameless victim of police brutality. The revelation of Luciano's murder sparked national outrage. The case became a symbol of the widespread problem of police violence in Argentina, particularly against young people from marginalized communities. His death highlighted the deep-rooted issues of corruption, impunity, and discrimination within the Argentine police force. Many citizens were shocked by the realization that a teenager like Luciano, simply because of his background and the area he came from, had been targeted by those meant to protect him. Luciano Arruga's case became a call to action for activists, human rights organizations, and the families of other victims of police violence. People across Argentina began to demand reforms within the police force, calling for better oversight, accountability, and transparency. The case also sparked broader conversations about the relationship between police and communities in poverty-stricken areas. The fact that the police had been able to abuse their power with such impunity for years was a wake-up call for many, and the case led to a push for greater reforms in the criminal justice system to protect vulnerable citizens from future abuse. The case of Luciano Arruga did not end with the discovery of the truth behind his death. Instead, it ignited a long and tireless battle for justice that exposed the deeply entrenched corruption and abuses within Argentina's law enforcement system. His family's fight, particularly his mother's relentless search for accountability, would continue for years, and the case would serve as a catalyst for broader societal changes in the way police violence and impunity were handled in the country. After the discovery that Luciano had been detained and tortured by police before being killed, the case quickly gained national attention. His mother, Maria, who had been pushing for answers since his disappearance, became the symbol of a mother's undying commitment to justice. She publicly accused the police officers involved in her son's death and demanded that the authorities bring those responsible to trial. Despite the challenges they faced, Luciano's family, alongside human rights organizations, continued to put pressure on the justice system to ensure that those who had caused Luciano's death were held accountable. The struggle for justice was not an easy one. At first, the case seemed to move at a glacial pace, and many felt that the police officers involved would never be prosecuted. Corruption within the police force ran deep, and the case highlighted just how far some officers were willing to go to cover up their actions. During the investigation, evidence surfaced that police officers had attempted to falsify records and intimidate witnesses. Despite these efforts to derail the case, the growing public outcry put increasing pressure on the justice system to act. In 2014, after the case was reopened, several police officers were arrested and charged with the torture and murder of Luciano Arruga. Among them was the officer who had been directly involved in Luciano's detention, a figure whose name had been linked to other cases of abuse within the same police district. The fact that these arrests were made, despite the long-standing impunity surrounding police violence, was seen as a major victory for the family and the larger fight against police corruption. However, the family and their supporters understood that this was only the beginning, and they remained vigilant in their pursuit of full justice. As the trial progressed, the defense strategies used by the accused officers were centered around denial and attempts to shift the blame onto others. The police officers tried to claim that they had acted within the boundaries of the law, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. In one of the more shocking revelations, it was discovered that the officers involved had tried to cover up their involvement by planting false evidence. They had lied about the circumstances of Luciano's death and attempted to falsify their reports to protect themselves. Yet, the public, fueled by the efforts of human rights activists, remained determined to see justice served. The trial also shed light on the broader problem of police violence against marginalized communities in Argentina. It became increasingly clear that Luciano's case was not an isolated incident. Over the years, many reports had surfaced of young people, especially those from poorer neighborhoods, being subjected to police violence, including arbitrary detention, beatings, and even death. These cases often went unpunished, and the public's trust in the police was eroded as the scale of the problem became more apparent. This widespread issue of police violence led to growing calls for reform within the Argentine police force. Human rights organizations, led by activists such as those who supported Luciano's family, demanded a complete overhaul of the police system. They argued that the entrenched corruption, lack of accountability, and culture of impunity within the force had to be addressed to prevent future tragedies. Proposals for reforms included better training for officers on human rights and the implementation of strict measures to investigate and punish misconduct. By 2016, a few of the officers involved in Luciano's death were convicted of crimes related to his torture and murder, and the family's years of struggle culminated in this moment of legal recognition. It was a long-awaited victory, but it came with bittersweet emotions for those who had fought so hard to expose the truth. The family could never undo the pain of losing their loved one, and the scars left by the injustice of his death would continue to haunt them. While the case of Luciano Arruga was ultimately seen as a triumph for human rights activists, it also marked the beginning of a larger societal shift in Argentina. His death and the subsequent trial brought attention to the growing epidemic of police violence against youth, particularly in impoverished communities. Public support for the prosecution of police officers and the demand for reform swelled as citizens realized that the violence they witnessed in their neighborhoods was not just the work of a few bad apples, but a systemic issue. Luciano's case also helped fuel the larger conversation about the protection of human rights in Argentina. The events surrounding his death and the subsequent legal battle highlighted the vulnerability of young people, especially those living in poverty, to abuse and neglect from the very institutions that were meant to protect them. The case brought to the forefront the importance of holding law enforcement accountable for their actions, ensuring that the police acted within the boundaries of the law and respected human rights. The public outrage generated by Luciano's case also contributed to a broader conversation about police reforms across Latin America, where similar instances of police abuse and impunity were widespread. The Latin American region had long struggled with police corruption, and the case of Luciano Arruga became a case study for how the justice system could potentially address these issues and work toward a more equitable future for all citizens. Furthermore, the fight for justice in Luciano's case was also part of the larger movement to address gender-based violence and police brutality. Women's organizations in Argentina, many of whom had already been fighting for gender equality and protection from violence, found common cause with those fighting against police violence. The case reinforced the intersectionality of struggles for human rights, showing that the fight for justice was not just about one issue, but about the systemic oppression and violence faced by vulnerable groups in society. Although the justice system in Argentina faced many challenges, including a lack of resources and political will to enact change, Luciano's case sparked a glimmer of hope that things could change. The trial of those responsible for his murder became an emblematic case for the reform of the police force and the need for more robust protections for marginalized communities. Luciano's mother, Maria, remained a tireless advocate for the cause, participating in protests, organizing marches, and calling for broader societal change. Her personal journey from grief to activism became a symbol of the resilience of families who had lost loved ones to state violence. Ultimately, Luciano Arruga's story was a painful reminder of the injustices that many young people in Argentina and across Latin America face on a daily basis. But it was also a story of perseverance, as his family's fight for justice helped expose systemic issues that had been hidden for far too long. While the victory in his case could never undo the loss of a life, it ensured that his death would not be in vain. His legacy lived on through the ongoing struggles of those who continued to fight for a more just and equitable society for all. Let's jump to next story. Story 6. In 2016, Argentina was rocked by the disappearance and death of Santiago Maldonado, a young man whose tragic fate would stir nationwide debates about human rights, state violence, and the treatment of indigenous communities. Maldonado, 28 years old at the time of his disappearance, had been participating in a protest organized by the Mapuche indigenous group in the Patagonian region of Argentina. His story became emblematic of the ongoing struggle for justice for Argentina's indigenous peoples, as well as the role that state forces, including the Gendarmeria, border police, played in the repression of social movements. Santiago Maldonado's disappearance began on the afternoon of August 1, 2017, during a protest in the southern province of Chubut. The protest was led by members of the Mapuche community, who had been fighting for the return of ancestral lands that had been taken by private companies and the government. The Mapuche people had long suffered from discrimination, displacement, and violence, and their efforts to reclaim their land had resulted in tensions with the Argentine government and private companies, particularly in the area of Patagonia, where many large-scale agribusinesses were operating. The Mapuche protesters were advocating for the return of these lands and the end of the government's repression. Santiago, a young man from Buenos Aires, had traveled to Patagonia to support the Mapuche cause. He was not an indigenous person, but he had long been an advocate for social justice, particularly for marginalized communities in Argentina. He believed in the right of indigenous peoples to reclaim their land and fought for the protection of their human rights. On that fateful day in August 2017, Santiago had joined the protest at a stretch of road in the Pulaf community, a Mapuche group located in the town of Esquel, Chubut. During the protest, the Gendarmeria, Argentina's border police, were called in to disperse the demonstrators. The presence of the Gendarmeria in this area was not unusual. They had frequently clashed with the Mapuche community over land rights and other disputes. On that day, tensions between the protesters and the police quickly escalated. The Gendarmeria moved in aggressively to clear the protesters from the area, and it was during this operation that Santiago Maldonado disappeared. According to several witnesses, Santiago was seen running away from the scene as the police advanced on the protesters. One witness reported seeing him being chased by Gendarmeria officers before he disappeared into the surrounding woods. However, after that moment, Santiago was never seen again. His family was immediately alarmed, and they began searching for him. Santiago's disappearance was initially downplayed by the authorities, who suggested that he may have simply fled the scene and hidden. However, as days passed without any sign of him, the severity of the situation became increasingly clear. Santiago's family began to worry that the authorities were not taking the case seriously, and that there was a cover-up surrounding his disappearance. His brother, Sergio Maldonado, became a vocal advocate for Santiago's return, demanding that the government and the Gendarmeria be held accountable for the situation. The family suspected that the police were involved in Santiago's disappearance and feared that he had been detained by the Gendarmeria during the protest. Despite the official claims that Santiago had simply run away, the family believed that he had been forcibly taken by the police and that his life was in danger. The lack of answers from the authorities prompted widespread protests across Argentina. Civil society groups, human rights organizations, and activists quickly mobilized, calling for a full investigation into Santiago's disappearance. The case became a symbol of the government's treatment of indigenous communities and the excessive use of force by security agencies against protesters. The public outcry surrounding Santiago's disappearance grew louder with each passing day. It became clear that this was not just a case of a missing person. It was a case of potential state violence, with the Gendarmeria implicated in his disappearance. The Argentine government, led by President Mauricio Macri, initially downplayed the significance of the case. The government claimed that there was no evidence of state involvement in Santiago's disappearance and suggested that he had likely gone into hiding voluntarily. However, the Maldonado family, along with many activists and human rights groups, remained steadfast in their demand for a proper investigation. The Argentine press also began to focus heavily on the case, with journalists investigating the role of the Gendarmeria and examining the relationship between the police and the Mapuche community. In the months following Santiago's disappearance, the case took a disturbing turn. The family and activists continued to demand that the authorities conduct a thorough investigation, but they felt that the government was not taking the matter seriously. Meanwhile, several reports surfaced indicating that the Gendarmeria had used excessive force against the Mapuche protesters, and that their actions may have contributed to Santiago's disappearance. On August 17, 2017, 2 weeks after Santiago went missing, the Argentine Federal Police and the Gendarmeria launched an official search for the missing man, but there were still no solid leads. By mid-October, the search for Santiago took a tragic turn. His body was discovered on October 17, 2017, in the Chubut River, approximately 400 meters from where the protest had taken place. His body was found in a state of advanced decomposition, and it appeared to have been in the water for several weeks. The discovery of Santiago's body raised many questions about how he had ended up in the river. Was his death the result of a tragic accident, or was it the result of foul play? The discovery of his body led to more questions and fueled the suspicions of the Maldonado family, who continued to believe that Santiago had been forcibly detained by the Gendarmeria. The government, however, insisted that there was no evidence to suggest foul play, and they suggested that Santiago had drowned in the river accidentally. This claim was met with widespread skepticism, as many believed that the Gendarmeria had played a role in his death. Forensic analysis of Santiago's body revealed no signs of physical trauma or violence, but the circumstances surrounding his disappearance and death remained deeply suspicious. Despite the government's insistence on the accidental nature of his death, many activists and citizens were unconvinced. The debate over whether Santiago Maldonado had been the victim of state violence and cover-up continued to divide the country. The case of Santiago Maldonado is one that remains unresolved in many people's minds. His death became a symbol of the struggle for indigenous rights in Argentina, as well as the broader issues of police brutality, state violence, and the treatment of social movements. The incident sparked a national conversation about the role of the police in repressing protests and the rights of citizens to peacefully express their views. The tragedy highlighted the risks faced by individuals who were willing to speak out against the government and the system. After the discovery of Santiago Maldonado's body on October 17, 2017, the case became a highly politicized and controversial matter, dividing the nation and drawing international attention. As his family and supporters mourned the loss of a young man who had become an emblem of the struggle for indigenous rights and social justice, the Argentine government faced mounting pressure to explain the circumstances of his death. The question on everyone's mind was whether Santiago had died as a result of an accident or whether state forces, specifically the Gendarmeria, were responsible for his death. The official narrative put forward by the Argentine government was that Santiago had drowned in the Chubut River after fleeing from the Gendarmeria during the August 1st protest. According to the authorities, there was no indication of foul play, and the cause of death was ultimately attributed to drowning, despite the family's insistence that the Gendarmeria's actions were directly linked to his disappearance and death. This explanation, however, was met with skepticism from many corners of Argentine society, including human rights groups, the public, and even some members of the opposition. In response to the mounting suspicion and public outcry, the Argentine Ministry of Security, led by Patricia Bullrich, initiated an investigation into the circumstances surrounding Santiago's death. However, many critics, particularly those aligned with the left-wing and human rights groups, were quick to point out that the government's narrative seemed to downplay the possibility that Santiago's death could have been the result of police brutality. The connection between the Gendarmeria's actions during the protest and Santiago's disappearance seemed too significant to ignore. Furthermore, the lack of transparency in the investigation led many to believe that the government was attempting to cover up state violence. The Maldonado family, still reeling from their loss, remained steadfast in their demands for accountability. The family and their supporters, including the Mapuche community, continued to argue that Santiago had been subjected to police violence. His brother, Sergio Maldonado, became the face of the movement for justice, regularly appearing in public to denounce the government's handling of the case. He emphasized that Santiago had been seen by witnesses being chased by the Gendarmeria, and his family was adamant that their loved one had not died as a result of a simple accident. As the investigation continued, there were mounting signs of dysfunction and resistance to accountability within the Argentine legal system. Investigators questioned the police officers involved in the incident, but many of them denied any involvement in Santiago's disappearance. Some even claimed that they had not seen Santiago during the protest, which further frustrated the efforts of the Maldonado family and their supporters. In an attempt to clarify the cause of Santiago's death, a forensic team conducted an autopsy on his body. The autopsy revealed that Santiago had indeed drowned, but it did not provide a definitive answer as to how he had ended up in the river. Crucially, the report did not find any physical trauma or signs of violent injuries on Santiago's body, which left the door open for different interpretations of his death. While the autopsy seemed to rule out the possibility of foul play through direct violence, it did not discount the possibility that Santiago had been forcibly detained, mistreated, or even placed in the river by the police. As the case unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the conflict between the government and indigenous groups, as well as the government's strained relationship with social movements in Argentina, played a key role in the political fallout from Santiago's death. Many believed that the Gendarmeria had been engaged in an aggressive campaign of repression against the Mapuche people in particular, who had long faced marginalization and violence from both state and corporate forces. Santiago, as an outsider who had come to show solidarity with the Mapuche, became a martyr for the cause of social justice and indigenous rights. In the political arena, the case highlighted the divisions between the center-right government of President Mauricio Macri and the left-wing opposition. The Macri government was accused by some of being complicit in state violence, while the opposition accused the administration of not doing enough to protect the rights of marginalized communities. The case became a focal point for protests, particularly those in support of the Mapuche, who saw Santiago's death as a direct consequence of the government's failure to protect indigenous peoples and uphold their basic rights. In the days following Santiago's death, massive protests erupted across Argentina, with thousands taking to the streets to demand justice. The protests, led by human rights organizations, activists, and members of the Mapuche community, called for an independent investigation into the role of the Gendarmeria in Santiago's death. Many people who had previously not been involved in indigenous rights movements began to rally behind the cause, seeing Santiago as a symbol of the struggles faced by marginalized groups in Argentina. For weeks, the protests continued to grow, with demonstrators demanding transparency and justice. The image of Santiago's face became iconic, appearing on posters, banners, and social media, as people expressed their outrage over what they believed to be a cover-up by the authorities. The case of Santiago Maldonado had become a touchstone for a broader conversation about human rights, social justice, and the role of the state in the lives of its citizens. Despite the government's insistence that Santiago's death was an unfortunate accident, the continued protests and calls for justice signaled that the truth had yet to be fully revealed. Human rights groups continued to demand accountability, and the issue of police violence and impunity remained at the forefront of national discourse. In particular, there was widespread concern that the police and security forces, including the Gendarmeria, had been allowed to operate without adequate oversight and accountability, especially when dealing with indigenous communities and social movements. The investigation also had international ramifications. Santiago's case garnered attention from international human rights organizations, which condemned the Argentine government for its handling of the case. The United Nations and Amnesty International issued statements calling for a full and impartial investigation, urging the Argentine authorities to ensure that those responsible for Santiago's death, if any, were brought to justice. International observers expressed concern about the potential for state violence and the criminalization of social movements in Argentina, and the case became a symbol of the broader struggles for human rights in Latin America. While the investigation into Santiago's death continued, the tension between the government and the Argentine people remained high. The case had exposed the deep fractures in Argentine society, highlighting the inequities faced by indigenous communities and the growing dissatisfaction with the government's treatment of marginalized groups. For many, the fight for justice in Santiago Maldonado's case was far from over, and it became a symbol of the ongoing struggle for dignity, human rights, and accountability in Argentina. The controversy surrounding the death of Santiago Maldonado did not end with the discovery of his body or the autopsy results. The investigation continued to unfold over the subsequent months, revealing deep divisions within Argentine society and highlighting systemic issues related to the treatment of indigenous communities, police violence, and the impunity of state forces. Despite the government's official stance that his death was an accident, many activists, human rights organizations, and members of the public remained unconvinced, believing that the true circumstances of Santiago's death had not been fully uncovered. The case became a rallying point for social justice movements and ignited a broader conversation about human rights, police reform, and the state's relationship with its marginalized populations. Following the discovery of Santiago's body, the investigation continued under the jurisdiction of Argentina's federal courts. The forensic team had confirmed that he had drowned, but the evidence surrounding his final moments remained inconclusive. No clear answers were provided about how he ended up in the river, and the lack of transparency in the investigation led many to believe that the Gendarmeria's actions during the protest could have played a significant role in his death. There were questions about why Santiago, who had been part of the protest and had reportedly run away from the police, ended up in the river in such a mysterious and unclear manner. The most troubling aspect of the case was the perceived lack of accountability for the police officers involved. The political fallout from Santiago's death also continued to shape the national discourse. The case became a flashpoint for growing dissatisfaction with President Mauricio Macri's administration, which was widely accused of neglecting the needs and rights of marginalized communities, especially indigenous peoples. The Macri government's reluctance to hold the Gendarmeria accountable further fueled suspicions that the state was complicit in Santiago's death. Public outrage reached its peak in October and November 2017, when large-scale protests were held across the country, demanding justice for Santiago and calling for reforms to ensure the protection of human rights and the rights of indigenous communities. The Justice for Santiago Maldonado campaign became a prominent movement, supported by a wide range of civil society groups, human rights organizations, and activists. People from all walks of life participated in marches, rallies, and protests, demanding a fair and impartial investigation into Santiago's death. Many of these demonstrations took place in Buenos Aires, where thousands of citizens gathered in the Plaza de Mayo, one of the country's most iconic locations for political protests. The widespread participation in these protests demonstrated the extent to which Santiago's case resonated with the public and sparked a deeper conversation about police violence, state repression, and the treatment of indigenous peoples in Argentina. One of the most important aspects of the protests was the role of the Mapuche community, which had long struggled for land rights and social justice in Argentina. For the Mapuche, Santiago's death was not just a tragic event, but a manifestation of the state's long history of marginalization and violence against indigenous people. Santiago's involvement in the Mapuche-led protest highlighted the connection between his death and the broader issues facing indigenous communities. The Mapuche, who had long been fighting for the return of ancestral lands, saw in Santiago's death the dangers they faced when challenging the state and powerful corporate interests. In the midst of the protests and public outcry, the Argentine government remained firm in its position that there was no evidence of foul play and that Santiago had drowned accidentally. This stance, however, did little to quell the anger and frustration of those who believed that the police were involved in his death. Many critics of the government accused the authorities of attempting to cover up the role of the Gendarmeria in Santiago's disappearance. The ongoing protests, along with increasing international attention, put additional pressure on the government to take the case seriously and pursue a full and impartial investigation. In 2018, after months of legal and political wrangling, the Argentine courts announced that the case of Santiago Maldonado's death would not result in criminal charges against the Gendarmeria officers involved. The conclusion of the investigation was met with widespread disappointment and anger. Human rights organizations and activists expressed their dismay at the fact that, despite overwhelming public pressure and evidence of police misconduct, no one would be held accountable for Santiago's death. Many saw the decision as a clear indication of the deep-rooted impunity that existed within the Argentine police force and the justice system, where state violence against marginalized groups often went unpunished. Santiago's family, still grieving their loss, rejected the findings of the investigation and vowed to continue fighting for justice. His brother, Sergio Maldonado, along with other members of the family, continued to speak out about the injustice they believed their brother had faced. They maintained that the state had failed Santiago and the many other victims of police violence in Argentina. Despite the official conclusion that his death was accidental, the Maldonado family remained convinced that the Gendarmeria's actions had played a critical role in his tragic demise. The case of Santiago Maldonado also brought attention to the broader issue of police violence and human rights abuses in Argentina. For many, Santiago's death was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of state repression, particularly against social movements and indigenous communities. The investigation into his death revealed the extent to which police forces, such as the Gendarmeria, were often given free rein to use excessive force against protesters without facing significant consequences. Santiago's case became emblematic of the need for police reform and greater accountability in Argentina's law enforcement system. Internationally, Santiago Maldonado's case attracted significant attention. Human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and the United Nations issued statements condemning the Argentine government's handling of the investigation and calling for greater protections for human rights defenders. The international community expressed concern about the pattern of impunity for state violence in Argentina and the lack of effective mechanisms for holding police officers accountable for their actions. The case served as a stark reminder of the challenges that many Latin American countries faced in dealing with police violence, impunity, and the marginalization of indigenous communities. In the years following Santiago Maldonado's death, his story continued to resonate with activists and human rights groups in Argentina and beyond. The Justice for Santiago campaign remained active, with ongoing efforts to raise awareness about the systemic issues of state violence and the need for legal reforms. Santiago's death became a symbol of the fight for justice and the need to ensure that state violence, particularly against indigenous peoples and marginalized communities, was confronted and addressed. Despite the official closure of the investigation, the legacy of Santiago Maldonado's death remains an important chapter in the ongoing struggle for human rights and social justice in Argentina. His tragic fate highlighted the vulnerability of those who stood up for the rights of others and exposed the deep divisions within Argentine society regarding police violence, indigenous rights, and the protection of civil liberties. The case of Santiago Maldonado, like many other cases of state violence and impunity in Latin America, serves as a reminder of the need for vigilance, solidarity, and a commitment to justice in the face of systemic oppression. Let's jump to next story. Story 7. In 2016, Argentina witnessed a tragedy that would highlight the deep-seated issues of police brutality, human rights violations, and systemic inequality within the country. The case of Luciano Arruga, a young man from the working-class neighborhood of Lomas del Mirador in Buenos Aires, is a chilling reminder of the harsh realities faced by marginalized communities in Argentina. Luciano's story, marked by police violence, racial profiling, and a prolonged fight for justice, would become a symbol of the struggle against impunity in Argentina's law enforcement agencies. Luciano Arruga was just 16 years old when he disappeared on January 31, 2009. The teenager, who had been living in one of the poorest neighborhoods of Buenos Aires, was last seen by his family when he left his home to buy a few items from a nearby store. He never returned. His disappearance sent shockwaves through the local community, with his family immediately fearing that something terrible had happened. However, little did they know at the time, Luciano's disappearance was the beginning of a long and painful journey to uncover the truth about what had happened to him. Luciano's family initially assumed that the teenager had gotten into some kind of trouble, or perhaps had simply run away. But soon, they began to suspect that the police might have been involved in his disappearance. Luciano had been subjected to constant harassment and intimidation by the police prior to his disappearance. According to his family, the local police frequently stopped and searched him, accusing him of petty crimes and threatening him with violence. The authorities' treatment of Luciano was not an isolated case, but rather part of a larger pattern of abuse and mistreatment of young people, particularly those from poor neighborhoods. Racial profiling, discrimination, and police brutality were common experiences for many individuals living in marginalized communities like Lomas del Mirador. Despite the initial reluctance from the police to take Luciano's disappearance seriously, his family continued their search for answers. They were determined to find out what had happened to their son and brother. Over the course of several months, the family contacted local authorities, filed complaints, and reached out to human rights organizations, but their efforts seemed to be in vain. It wasn't until the following year that the first significant break in the case occurred. In 2010, more than a year after Luciano's disappearance, his body was discovered in a field, not far from his neighborhood, near the local cemetery. The discovery was both heartbreaking and perplexing, as it raised even more questions about how Luciano had ended up in such a remote area. The authorities initially suggested that Luciano had died from a car accident, a theory that was quickly dismissed by his family. The idea that a 16-year-old boy, who had been living in constant fear of police harassment, had simply wandered off and died accidentally seemed improbable. The family suspected that something far darker had occurred. The autopsy revealed that Luciano had been dead for several months before his body was discovered, and the cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma, likely caused by severe blows to the head. The theory of an accidental death was quickly abandoned, and a new theory emerged, that Luciano had been killed by the police. This theory was supported by the fact that Luciano had been stopped and harassed by local police officers in the days leading up to his disappearance. Witnesses came forward, claiming that they had seen police officers dragging a young man resembling Luciano into a patrol car shortly before he vanished. As the investigation progressed, it became increasingly clear that Luciano's death was not the result of an accident, but rather an act of police violence. The family's suspicions were further confirmed when it was revealed that Luciano had been a victim of police brutality. Evidence surfaced that showed that he had been tortured by police officers prior to his death. His body bore signs of severe physical abuse, including bruises, burns, and wounds consistent with the use of blunt instruments. These findings pointed to a chilling pattern of police violence against young people in Argentina's working-class neighborhoods. The evidence painted a picture of a young man who had been targeted by the police, subjected to violence, and ultimately killed as part of the authorities' ongoing abuse of power. As the case began to attract national attention, human rights groups and activists in Argentina started calling for a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding Luciano's death. The case became emblematic of the broader issue of police violence in Argentina, particularly against the country's marginalized communities. Many believe that Luciano had been targeted not only because of his youth and economic background, but also because of his perceived status as a socially expendable individual. This tragic case revealed the deep-rooted issues within the Argentine police force and the impunity that many officers enjoyed, allowing them to engage in violent acts without fear of consequences. Luciano's family, devastated by the loss of their loved one, was determined to seek justice. They became vocal advocates for victims of police violence, demanding accountability for the officers involved in Luciano's death. The case drew widespread support from human rights organizations, social justice movements, and citizens across Argentina who saw in Luciano's story a symbol of the larger struggles faced by the country's poor and marginalized populations. For many, the case was a painful reminder of the systemic violence and discrimination that permeated Argentina's law enforcement institutions. In the years following the discovery of Luciano's body, the investigation into his death proceeded at a slow and often frustrating pace. The family and their supporters accused the authorities of deliberately stalling the investigation and failing to hold the responsible police officers accountable. Despite mounting evidence that Luciano had been killed by police officers, no significant progress was made in bringing the perpetrators to justice. The case exposed the deep flaws within Argentina's justice system, where police brutality was often overlooked or excused, particularly when the victims were from poor or marginalized backgrounds. The lack of justice in Luciano's case led to widespread protests, rallies, and public outcry. In 2014, a group of human rights organizations and social activists organized a large-scale demonstration to demand justice for Luciano and other victims of police violence. The march, which took place in Buenos Aires, was attended by thousands of people who wanted to show solidarity with Luciano's family and highlight the broader issues of police abuse and impunity. The event marked a turning point in the fight for justice, as it brought together people from diverse social and political backgrounds who were united in their demand for accountability and an end to the culture of impunity within Argentina's police force. Despite the public pressure and growing demand for justice, the investigation into Luciano's death continued to face significant obstacles. For years, there were delays in bringing the case to trial, and the police officers involved in the killing of Luciano remained free from prosecution. It wasn't until 2016 that the case began to gain momentum, as new evidence and witness testimonies emerged. In May of that year, after years of investigation, a court finally charged several police officers in connection with Luciano's death, marking a significant step toward justice. Luciano Arruga's death, along with the long and painful fight for justice that followed, brought attention to the ongoing struggles faced by the marginalized communities of Argentina. His case became a symbol of the fight against police violence and the need for systemic reform within Argentina's law enforcement agencies. The case also highlighted the deeply entrenched issues of classism, racism, and social inequality in Argentina, where young people from poor neighborhoods were disproportionately targeted by the police. In the years following Luciano's death, his story continued to inspire activism and advocacy for the rights of marginalized communities. His family's determination to seek justice and hold the responsible officers accountable served as a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up against injustice, no matter how insurmountable the odds may seem. In 2016, Argentina witnessed a tragedy that would highlight the deep-seated issues of police brutality, human rights violations, and systemic inequality within the country. The case of Luciano Arruga, a young man from the working-class neighborhood of Lomas del Mirador in Buenos Aires, is a chilling reminder of the harsh realities faced by marginalized communities in Argentina. Luciano's story, marked by police violence, racial profiling, and a prolonged fight for justice, would become a symbol of the struggle against impunity in Argentina's law enforcement agencies. Luciano Arruga was just 16 years old when he disappeared on January 31, 2009. The teenager, who had been living in one of the poorest neighborhoods of Buenos Aires, was last seen by his family when he left his home to buy a few items from a nearby store. He never returned. His disappearance sent shockwaves through the local community, with his family immediately fearing that something terrible had happened. However, little did they know at the time, Luciano's disappearance was the beginning of a long and painful journey to uncover the truth about what had happened to him. Luciano's family initially assumed that the teenager had gotten into some kind of trouble, or perhaps had simply run away. But soon, they began to suspect that the police might have been involved in his disappearance. Luciano had been subjected to constant harassment and intimidation by the police prior to his disappearance. According to his family, the local police frequently stopped and searched him, accusing him of petty crimes and threatening him with violence. The authorities' treatment of Luciano was not an isolated case, but rather part of a larger pattern of abuse and mistreatment of young people, particularly those from poor neighborhoods. Racial profiling, discrimination, and police brutality were common experiences for many individuals living in marginalized communities like Lomas del Mirador. Despite the initial reluctance from the police to take Luciano's disappearance seriously, his family continued their search for answers. They were determined to find out what had happened to their son and brother. Over the course of several months, the family contacted local authorities, filed complaints, and reached out to human rights organizations, but their efforts seemed to be in vain. It wasn't until the following year that the first significant break in the case occurred. In 2010, more than a year after Luciano's disappearance, his body was discovered in a field, not far from his neighborhood, near the local cemetery. The discovery was both heartbreaking and perplexing, as it raised even more questions about how Luciano had ended up in such a remote area. The authorities initially suggested that Luciano had died from a car accident, a theory that was quickly dismissed by his family. The idea that a 16-year-old boy, who had been living in constant fear of police harassment, had simply wandered off and died accidentally seemed improbable. The family suspected that something far darker had occurred. The autopsy revealed that Luciano had been dead for several months before his body was discovered, and the cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma, likely caused by severe blows to the head. The theory of an accidental death was quickly abandoned, and a new theory emerged, that Luciano had been killed by the police. This theory was supported by the fact that Luciano had been stopped and harassed by local police officers in the days leading up to his disappearance. Witnesses came forward, claiming that they had seen police officers dragging a young man resembling Luciano into a patrol car shortly before he vanished. As the investigation progressed, it became increasingly clear that Luciano's death was not the result of an accident, but rather an act of police violence. The family's suspicions were further confirmed when it was revealed that Luciano had been a victim of police brutality. Evidence surfaced that showed that he had been tortured by police officers prior to his death. His body bore signs of severe physical abuse, including bruises, burns, and wounds consistent with the use of blunt instruments. These findings pointed to a chilling pattern of police violence against young people in Argentina's working-class neighborhoods. The evidence painted a picture of a young man who had been targeted by the police, subjected to violence, and ultimately killed as part of the authorities' ongoing abuse of power. As the case began to attract national attention, human rights groups and activists in Argentina started calling for a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding Luciano's death. The case became emblematic of the broader issue of police violence in Argentina, particularly against the country's marginalized communities. Many believed that Luciano had been targeted not only because of his youth and economic background, but also because of his perceived status as a socially expendable individual. This tragic case revealed the deep-rooted issues within the Argentine police force and the impunity that many officers enjoyed, allowing them to engage in violent acts without fear of consequences. Luciano's family, devastated by the loss of their loved one, was determined to seek justice. They became vocal advocates for victims of police violence, demanding accountability for the officers involved in Luciano's death. The case drew widespread support from human rights organizations, social justice movements, and citizens across Argentina, who saw in Luciano's story a symbol of the larger struggles faced by the country's poor and marginalized populations. For many, the case was a painful reminder of the systemic violence and discrimination that permeated Argentina's law enforcement institutions. In the years following the discovery of Luciano's body, the investigation into his death proceeded at a slow and often frustrating pace. The family and their supporters accused the authorities of deliberately stalling the investigation and failing to hold the responsible police officers accountable. Despite mounting evidence that Luciano had been killed by police officers, no significant progress was made in bringing the perpetrators to justice. The case exposed the deep flaws within Argentina's justice system, where police brutality was often overlooked or excused, particularly when the victims were from poor or marginalized backgrounds. The lack of justice in Luciano's case led to widespread protests, rallies, and public outcry. In 2014, a group of human rights organizations and social activists organized a large-scale demonstration to demand justice for Luciano and other victims of police violence. The march, which took place in Buenos Aires, was attended by thousands of people who wanted to show solidarity with Luciano's family and highlight the broader issues of police abuse and impunity. The event marked a turning point in the fight for justice, as it brought together people from diverse social and political backgrounds who were united in their demand for accountability and an end to the culture of impunity within Argentina's police force. Despite the public pressure and growing demand for justice, the investigation into Luciano's death continued to face significant obstacles. For years, there were delays in bringing the case to trial, and the police officers involved in the killing of Luciano remained free from prosecution. It wasn't until 2016 that the case began to gain momentum, as new evidence and witness testimonies emerged. In May of that year, after years of investigation, a court finally charged several police officers in connection with Luciano's death, marking a significant step toward justice. Luciano Arruga's death, along with the long and painful fight for justice that followed, brought attention to the ongoing struggles faced by the marginalized communities of Argentina. His case became a symbol of the fight against police violence and the need for systemic reform within Argentina's law enforcement agencies. The case also highlighted the deeply entrenched issues of classism, racism, and social inequality in Argentina, where young people from poor neighborhoods were disproportionately targeted by the police. In the years following Luciano's death, his story continued to inspire activism and advocacy for the rights of marginalized communities. His family's determination to seek justice and hold the responsible officers accountable served as a powerful reminder of the importance of standing up against injustice, no matter how insurmountable the odds may seem. Despite the legal challenges and setbacks, Luciano Arruga's case marked a significant turning point in the ongoing struggle against police violence and systemic injustice in Argentina. While justice for Luciano's death came in the form of some convictions and legal recognition of the brutality he endured, his case also exposed the deeper flaws within Argentina's justice system and law enforcement institutions. The fight for accountability, however, did not end with the conviction of the officers involved. It set in motion a broader movement that called for continued reform and a re-examination of the relationships between the police, marginalized communities, and the state. The trial that took place in 2016 and led to the conviction of police officers involved in Luciano's death was, for many, an important moment in the fight for justice. However, the pace at which the case had progressed, and the challenges the Arruga family faced during the legal process, underscored the persistent issue of impunity within Argentina's law enforcement and judicial systems. The fact that it took so many years for charges to be filed and for the case to gain the attention it deserved speaks to the deep-rooted issues of corruption, favoritism, and disregard for the rights of marginalized citizens that continue to plague Argentina's legal and police institutions. The case of Luciano Arruga became a focal point for ongoing conversations about police brutality and the mistreatment of young people, particularly those from impoverished or working-class neighborhoods. Young people in these areas, many of whom are from low-income backgrounds or belong to marginalized ethnic groups, often experience routine harassment, racial profiling, and even violence at the hands of law enforcement officers. This pattern of abuse is not unique to Luciano's case, but reflects a much larger social and political issue within Argentina that calls for systemic reform. Luciano's story also became an important symbol for the broader movement advocating for the rights of indigenous communities, the poor, and other marginalized groups in Argentina. In the years following his death, activists and human rights organizations rallied around the cause, demanding that police violence be brought to an end and that the culture of impunity within law enforcement be dismantled. The Justicia por Luciano Arruga movement gained widespread attention, becoming a platform for activism on behalf of all victims of police violence. One of the most notable aspects of Luciano's case was the role played by his family in keeping his memory alive and demanding justice. His mother, Laura Arruga, became a tireless advocate for human rights and a symbol of resilience and determination. Laura and other members of the Arruga family did not rest after the conviction of the police officers. They continued to speak out, not only about their son's death, but also about the countless other individuals who had suffered from similar violence. Through interviews, protests, and public engagements, the Arruga family helped shine a light on the larger, unaddressed issue of police brutality in Argentina, ensuring that Luciano's death would not be forgotten. While there was some progress in the legal proceedings, Luciano's case also served to highlight the gap between legal victories and real social change. The officers convicted for their role in Luciano's death were, in many ways, exceptions to the rule. The vast majority of cases involving police brutality in Argentina, particularly those involving poor or marginalized victims, do not receive the same level of attention or lead to convictions. Many victims of police violence, particularly young people from working-class neighborhoods or indigenous communities, still face an uphill battle in securing justice. The persistence of impunity in cases of police violence remains one of the most pressing issues in the country's legal and social landscape. Luciano's case also contributed to a wider reckoning with the legacy of the military dictatorship that ruled Argentina from 1976 to 1983. During that time, tens of thousands of people were forcibly disappeared, tortured, and killed by the state's military and police forces. Though the dictatorship ended more than 3 decades ago, the culture of violence, impunity, and abuse within the police force continued to persist. The case of Luciano Arruga, like the cases of many others who have been victims of state violence, pointed to the ongoing scars left by this dark chapter in Argentine history. The struggle for justice for Luciano and countless others was as much about confronting this legacy as it was about securing accountability for the crimes committed. As the years passed, the demand for police reform and better protection of human rights remained a central issue for the social movements that had rallied behind Luciano's case. One of the key components of these efforts was the call for an end to racial profiling, which disproportionately affected young people from marginalized communities, especially those of indigenous and African descent. Racial profiling, as evidenced in Luciano's case, often leads to harassment, violence, and the criminalization of innocent individuals based solely on their appearance or social status. Human rights organizations argued that this practice was not only unjust but also unconstitutional and incompatible with the ideals of a democratic society. Another important aspect of the ongoing struggle was the demand for greater oversight and accountability within the police force. Many believed that the internal mechanisms for holding police officers accountable were insufficient, and that greater transparency was needed to ensure that officers who engaged in abuse or criminal activity were held responsible for their actions. This demand for greater accountability extended beyond individual cases like Luciano's to encompass broader reforms within the police and justice systems. Advocates for police reform called for the establishment of independent oversight bodies that could monitor police conduct and investigate complaints of abuse without bias or interference from the state. Luciano's death also highlighted the inadequacies of the Argentine judicial system in dealing with cases of police violence. The slow pace of the investigation, the repeated delays, and the reluctance to bring charges against officers were clear signs of the entrenched issues of corruption and inefficiency within the justice system. While some progress was made with the eventual conviction of the officers involved in Luciano's death, there remained a deep mistrust between the public and the legal system. For many, the case revealed the stark contrast between the formal legal process and the lived reality of individuals seeking justice in a system that often seemed designed to protect those in power rather than ensure fairness for all. Despite the ongoing challenges, the case of Luciano Arruga remains a powerful symbol of resistance against police violence and impunity in Argentina. It showed that, even in the face of overwhelming obstacles, it is possible for individuals and families to fight for justice and to demand that those in power be held accountable. The movement for justice for Luciano, as well as the broader call for police reform and human rights protection, continues to inspire new generations of activists and advocates committed to making Argentina a more just and equal society. Luciano's story serves as a reminder that the struggle for justice is far from over. It is a call to action for anyone who believes in the power of collective action and the importance of standing up for the rights of the most vulnerable members of society. While his death was a tragic loss, it also served as a catalyst for change, sparking a nationwide conversation about police violence, human rights, and the need for a more equitable and accountable society. Let's jump to next story. Story 8. In 2016, Argentina faced a tragic and highly publicized case that underscored the ongoing issues of police violence, discrimination, and human rights violations in the country. The case of Rafael Noel, a young indigenous man who was shot and killed by police during an operation in the Patagonian region of Argentina, would come to symbolize the struggle of marginalized communities, particularly indigenous groups, in their fight for justice and recognition. Rafael's death raised critical questions about the use of excessive force by law enforcement and the systemic discrimination faced by indigenous people in Argentina. Rafael Noel was 22 years old when he was killed on November 25, 2017, during a confrontation between police officers and members of the Mapuche indigenous community in the Patagonia region of Argentina. Rafael was part of a group of Mapuche activists who had been protesting against the government's policies regarding land rights and the expansion of private land owned by large corporations. The Mapuche people, who are one of the largest indigenous groups in Argentina, have long been fighting for the return of ancestral lands that they claim have been illegally taken over by the state and private businesses. The conflict over land rights and the treatment of indigenous communities has been a source of tension and violence for decades. The incident that led to Rafael's death occurred in the context of an ongoing dispute between the Mapuche community and the Argentine government. The government had been attempting to evict Mapuche activists who had occupied land in the southern province of Rio Negro, claiming it as their ancestral territory. The confrontation escalated when the police were sent to evict the activists, who had set up camps on the disputed land. The operation was meant to clear the area and remove the protesters, but it quickly turned violent. On the day of Rafael's death, police officers from the Argentine Federal Forces, including the Special Operations Group GOS, arrived in the area to carry out the eviction. According to witnesses and activists who were present during the operation, the police used excessive force in dealing with the protesters. Gunshots were fired at the group, and Rafael Noel was hit by a bullet. He was immediately rushed to the hospital, but was declared dead from his injuries shortly after arrival. Rafael's death was not just another tragedy. It was seen as a direct result of the heavy-handed tactics used by the police and the long-standing discrimination and violence against indigenous people in Argentina. Following Rafael's death, his family and the Mapuche community were quick to accuse the police of using excessive force and targeting their group specifically because of their activism. They argued that the police were not only attempting to evict the protesters, but were also acting with hostility toward the Mapuche people because of their indigenous identity. The incident, they argued, was a clear example of the ongoing marginalization of indigenous communities in Argentina, particularly in the context of their struggles for land rights and political recognition. Rafael's family and supporters demanded a full investigation into the circumstances surrounding his death. They accused the police of using lethal force when it was not necessary and claimed that Rafael's death was a result of racial profiling and discrimination. They pointed to the pattern of violence and intimidation that indigenous communities in Argentina have faced for years. It wasn't the first time that the Argentine government and police had used force against Mapuche activists, but Rafael's death brought the issue to national and international attention. In the aftermath of the incident, protests broke out across Argentina, with many people expressing outrage over the death of Rafael Noel. Indigenous activists, human rights organizations, and civil society groups condemned the police's actions and demanded justice for Rafael. The case became a symbol of the ongoing struggle of the Mapuche people and other indigenous communities in Argentina, who have long fought for their rights and recognition in the face of systemic discrimination. The incident also led to widespread criticism of the Argentine government, particularly the security policies of President Mauricio Macri's administration. Macri's government had been criticized for its heavy-handed approach toward indigenous activism and land disputes, and the events surrounding Rafael's death only served to fuel this criticism. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, called for an independent investigation into Rafael's death and urged the Argentine government to address the broader issue of police violence against indigenous communities. In the weeks following Rafael's death, tensions continued to rise as more details about the police operation were revealed. Witnesses and activists accused the authorities of attempting to cover up the circumstances surrounding the shooting. There were reports of the police preventing journalists and independent observers from entering the area where Rafael was killed, further fueling suspicions of a cover-up. The lack of transparency in the initial stages of the investigation only deepened the public's mistrust of the police and the government's handling of the case. The Argentine government, for its part, denied any wrongdoing and claimed that the police had acted in self-defense during the operation. They argued that the Mapuche activists had been armed and had fired on the police, which led to the officers responding with force. However, there was no clear evidence to support this claim, and the police's version of events was widely disputed by witnesses and activists who were present during the confrontation. As the investigation progressed, the authorities struggled to provide a clear and consistent explanation for the events that led to Rafael's death. The lack of accountability and the delays in the investigation further inflamed the already tense situation. Rafael's family and their supporters were determined to see justice done, but the case remained mired in uncertainty and political infighting. The killing of Rafael Noel highlighted the complex and deeply entrenched issues of police violence, racial discrimination, and the marginalization of indigenous communities in Argentina. For the Mapuche people, Rafael's death was not just a personal tragedy. It was a reflection of the broader systemic issues that have long plagued their communities. The fight for land rights, cultural recognition, and justice for victims of police violence had become even more urgent and Rafael's death would serve as a rallying cry for indigenous groups and human rights activists across Argentina. Rafael's death also brought renewed attention to the issue of police militarization in Argentina. The operation that led to his death involved not just local police officers, but also federal security forces, raising questions about the increasing use of military-style tactics in domestic policing. The use of force against protesters, particularly indigenous activists, was seen by many as an example of the militarization of policing and the growing authoritarianism of the Argentine state. Despite the overwhelming public outcry and the calls for accountability, justice for Rafael Noel was slow to materialize. The case was further complicated by the lack of cooperation from the police and the state's reluctance to hold law enforcement accountable for their actions. The incident exemplified the challenges faced by indigenous communities in Argentina, who have long struggled to have their voices heard and their rights respected. As the legal proceedings moved forward, the fight for justice for Rafael continued. His family, supported by indigenous activists and human rights organizations, remained determined to seek the truth about his death and to ensure that those responsible for his killing were held accountable. But the case also underscored the broader issues of police violence and impunity in Argentina, and it became clear that the struggle for justice would not be easily won. The aftermath of Rafael Noel's death sparked widespread public outrage and mobilized both local and international communities to demand accountability. His family, activists, and indigenous groups led protests calling for a transparent investigation and justice for Rafael. But the legal proceedings and investigation into his death faced significant challenges from the start. The lack of clarity and accountability, combined with accusations of police misconduct, only fueled distrust toward the authorities and highlighted the deep issues within Argentina's law enforcement and judicial systems. The official narrative, as presented by the Argentine government, claimed that the police were acting in self-defense during the operation that led to Rafael's death. According to the police, they had been ambushed by armed Mapuche activists while they were attempting to evict the protesters from the land in Rio Negro. They argued that they had been forced to respond with force after coming under fire. However, this version of events was widely disputed by eyewitnesses, activists, and Rafael's family, who claimed that the police had used disproportionate force and that Rafael had been targeted because of his indigenous background and activism. One of the first major hurdles in the investigation was the lack of cooperation from the police involved in the operation. Several officers who had been present at the scene were either not questioned or gave conflicting testimonies. The police refused to provide detailed accounts of what transpired during the confrontation, and it soon became apparent that some officers were attempting to cover up their actions. This lack of transparency from the authorities undermined the credibility of the investigation and led many to believe that the police were being protected by institutional powers. The Argentine judicial system, notorious for its sluggishness and reluctance to confront powerful institutions, did not provide the swift response that the family and activists had hoped for. Instead, the investigation moved at a slow pace, with delays in filing charges and a lack of urgency in gathering evidence. This was particularly concerning to the indigenous community, which had long experienced discrimination and violence at the hands of the police and government forces. They saw the slow-moving investigation as yet another example of the systemic inequality and lack of justice faced by indigenous people in Argentina. A key turning point in the legal process occurred when human rights organizations and local activists began to apply public pressure on the Argentine government to ensure a thorough and transparent investigation. One of the most prominent organizations to advocate for justice in Rafael's case was the Argentine chapter of Amnesty International. Amnesty played a significant role in bringing international attention to the case and urging the Argentine authorities to conduct an impartial investigation. In addition to the advocacy efforts from human rights groups, the involvement of the Mapuche community was crucial in keeping the case alive. The Mapuche people, who had been fighting for land rights and against the systematic marginalization of their communities, rallied behind Rafael's family, demanding justice not only for him, but for all victims of state violence. The Mapuche community in Argentina is one of the largest indigenous groups in the country, but they have long struggled for recognition and equality. The murder of Rafael Noel served as a rallying point for the Mapuche and other indigenous communities who sought not just justice for a single case, but a broader recognition of their rights. As the investigation continued, more details began to emerge that contradicted the police's version of events. Eyewitnesses, including other activists who were present during the incident, stated that the police had been the aggressors and that the protesters had not been armed. These testimonies painted a much different picture than the one the authorities had initially put forward, suggesting that the police had acted recklessly and without provocation. Despite this, the investigation into Raphael's death continued to face delays, and it became increasingly clear that the legal system was not going to easily hold law enforcement accountable. In 2018, nearly 2 years after Raphael's death, the first breakthrough in the investigation occurred. After extensive public pressure and further investigation by independent bodies, the Argentine courts ordered the indictment of one police officer involved in the shooting. The officer was accused of having fired the fatal shot that killed Raphael. However, the fact that only one officer was charged raised concerns about the extent of the police involvement in the killing and the systemic issues within law enforcement. Many activists and human rights groups felt that the charge against the officer was just the tip of the iceberg, and that the true scope of police misconduct had yet to be fully uncovered. Despite this initial charge, there were still many questions left unanswered. The police officer who had been indicted continued to claim that he had acted in self-defense, a defense that was often used by officers involved in controversial shootings. The lack of concrete evidence and the slow pace of the judicial process left many feeling that justice for Raphael Noel was far from being achieved. Additionally, the broader issues of police violence and impunity, particularly against indigenous people, remained largely unaddressed. Raphael's case highlighted the stark realities faced by indigenous communities in Argentina, who have long struggled with discrimination, exclusion, and marginalization. Indigenous people in Argentina are often treated as second-class citizens, and their land rights and cultural heritage have historically been ignored or trampled upon by the government. This has resulted in a long history of tensions between indigenous groups and the state, as well as frequent confrontations between indigenous activists and law enforcement. Raphael's death also brought attention to the wider issue of police militarization in Argentina. The use of federal security forces, including the Special Operations Group, GOS, in the eviction of protesters raised concerns about the growing militarization of the police in Argentina. Critics argued that this trend not only led to the excessive use of force, but also contributed to a culture of impunity within law enforcement, where police officers felt emboldened to use violence with little fear of repercussions. Another critical aspect of the legal struggle in Raphael's case was the treatment of his family. The Noel family, particularly Raphael's mother, continued to demand justice for their son despite facing threats, harassment, and public pressure to drop the case. The family's determination to see justice served, despite the mounting obstacles, became an emblematic symbol of resistance against the injustices faced by indigenous people in Argentina. They refused to allow Raphael's death to be forgotten and remained steadfast in their pursuit of truth and accountability. In the broader context, Raphael's death came to symbolize the deep divisions within Argentine society and the persistent failure of the state to address the needs and rights of its indigenous population. The lack of a meaningful response from the government and law enforcement, coupled with the systemic nature of the violence and discrimination faced by indigenous communities, highlighted the challenges of achieving social justice in the country. By the end of 2018, as the trial for the officer charged with Raphael's killing continued, it was clear that the case had become much more than just a legal battle. It was a focal point for the broader movement for indigenous rights and social justice in Argentina, and it had sparked discussions about the relationship between the police and marginalized communities. However, the case also reflected the deep-seated issues within the Argentine justice system and the difficulties in holding powerful institutions accountable. As the legal proceedings related to the death of Raphael Noel continued, his case remained a significant and emotional point of discussion within Argentina. His killing highlighted not only the specific issues surrounding police violence against indigenous communities, but also the broader social and political challenges that Argentina faced regarding human rights, police reform, and the treatment of marginalized groups. The pursuit of justice for Raphael became a symbol of resistance for many indigenous communities and human rights activists, marking a key chapter in Argentina's ongoing battle for equality and justice. In 2019, after several years of legal back and forth, the trial for the officer accused of Raphael's death continued to unfold in the courts. The officer in question, a member of the Argentine Federal Police, was ultimately acquitted of all charges, despite widespread evidence and testimonies suggesting that excessive force had been used during the police operation. This acquittal sent shockwaves through the indigenous communities, human rights organizations, and civil society at large, as it became evident that the culture of impunity within the Argentine law enforcement and judicial systems remained deeply entrenched. For Rafael's family, the verdict was devastating. His mother, who had become a vocal and determined advocate for justice, expressed her deep disappointment with the outcome, which only reinforced the sense of frustration and helplessness felt by many marginalized communities. While the acquittal of the officer in question was a significant blow, it did not dampen the resolve of those who continued to fight for accountability. Rafael's case was far from over, and his family remained committed to ensuring that his death would not be forgotten and that the struggle for justice would persist. The decision in the trial raised broader questions about the effectiveness of the judicial system in holding law enforcement accountable for their actions. It highlighted the persistent power imbalance between the state and marginalized communities and exposed the deep mistrust that exists between the police and those who experience daily violence and discrimination at their hands. For many activists, the acquittal was a reminder of the ongoing challenges faced by victims of police violence, especially those from indigenous or working-class backgrounds. It reinforced the view that the Argentine justice system often failed to prioritize the needs and rights of these communities. While the legal aspect of Rafael's case seemed to falter, the legacy of his death continued to resonate. The case served as a rallying cry for continued activism and advocacy on behalf of indigenous people and other marginalized groups in Argentina. It also provided an opportunity for critical reflection on the role of police in society and the need for reform. His death became a part of a larger conversation about systemic racism, police militarization, and the urgent need for institutional change to prevent further violence against indigenous populations. Rafael Noel's death also underscored the deep-seated social and economic inequalities faced by indigenous communities in Argentina. For many Mapuche and other indigenous activists, Rafael's case was not an isolated incident, but part of a larger, ongoing struggle for recognition and land rights. Indigenous communities across Argentina have long fought for the return of ancestral lands that have been appropriated by the state and private corporations. These struggles have frequently led to violent confrontations with law enforcement, and the treatment of activists and protesters is often marked by brutality and indifference. Rafael's case also brought attention to the broader question of the protection of indigenous rights within Argentina's political system. Despite legal frameworks that recognize the rights of indigenous people, such as the 1994 constitutional reform that acknowledges indigenous peoples as subjects of public law, these rights are often disregarded in practice. Land disputes, discrimination, and the violence experienced by indigenous communities are issues that persist across Argentina, even though the country is home to one of the largest indigenous populations in Latin America. Rafael's case highlighted the gap between legal recognition and social reality, a gap that continues to undermine efforts for indigenous justice. One of the lasting impacts of Rafael's death has been the strengthening of grassroots movements and the growing solidarity among various activist groups fighting for indigenous rights in Argentina. The Mapuche community, in particular, has become increasingly vocal about their struggles and the need for state acknowledgement of their land rights. Rafael's death, though tragic, brought new attention to their cause, and his memory continues to inspire young activists to continue pushing for justice and recognition. The case also prompted a broader reflection on the role of police in Argentine society. The excessive force used during the eviction operation and the subsequent death of Rafael raised serious questions about the militarization of the police. Since the 1990s, Argentina has seen an increase in the deployment of federal forces in domestic policing, particularly in the context of land disputes and protests. The situation in Rio Negro was a stark example of how security forces were often used to repress dissent and maintain the interests of private landowners and the state. Many critics of the police's actions in Rafael's case saw it as an extension of the increasing militarization of the police, which they argued contributed to the normalization of violence against marginalized groups. In the years following Rafael Noel's death, the case continued to serve as a touchstone for broader discussions about the intersection of race, class, and state violence in Argentina. His death remains a powerful reminder of the need for systemic change and a just society that respects the rights of its most vulnerable citizens. The fight for justice in Raphael's name did not end with the trial verdicts. It became part of a larger ongoing struggle for the rights of indigenous people and the need for police accountability. While Raphael Noel's family and supporters have yet to see full justice for his death, the persistence of their struggle and the mobilization of indigenous communities across Argentina show that his death did not happen in vain. The broader fight for indigenous rights, police reform, and justice continues to be central to Argentina's human rights movement. As long as these issues remain unresolved, Raphael's legacy will continue to serve as a beacon of hope and a call to action for those fighting for a more just and equal society. Let's jump to next story. Story 9. In 2018, Argentina was shaken by a series of criminal events that captured national attention, one of the most prominent being the case of the vicarious robbery and homicide in the city of Buenos Aires. This case, though tragic, was one of the significant criminal events of the year and shed light on ongoing issues regarding organized crime, security policies, and the effectiveness of the judicial system in handling such cases. The crime took place on the evening of November 16, 2018, in a residential neighborhood of Buenos Aires. The victims, a couple in their late 40s, were at home when a group of armed individuals broke into their house. The robbers, who had been surveilling the house for days, had come prepared with the intent to steal valuables. They were aware that the couple had recently sold a property, and the assumption was that they would have significant amounts of cash at hand. The criminals, who were reportedly part of a larger organized crime syndicate, used extreme measures to gain access to the home. The couple had locked all doors and windows for safety, but the robbers, using tools, managed to break into the property. Inside, the couple was held at gunpoint and forced to reveal the location of their savings. In a moment of panic and fear, the robbers proceeded to search the home. During the robbery, the victims were threatened with harm, but fortunately, they did not suffer physical injuries at first. The criminals appeared focused on finding cash and valuable items, and they ransacked every room in the house. However, when they failed to find what they were looking for, tensions escalated. Frustrated, the robbers became more aggressive and, in the heat of the moment, they decided to escalate the situation further. At one point, the male victim tried to protect his wife, which led to one of the robbers attacking him with a blunt object. The victim, though injured, continued to defend his wife, prompting the robbers to act even more violently. In an unfortunate turn of events, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. The robbers, desperate to escape with their loot and fearing that the police might arrive soon, made a final, tragic decision. They escalated the violence by severely injuring the male victim and threatening the woman with even greater harm. Despite the violent confrontation, the robbers fled the scene before they could take anything valuable. By the time the police arrived, the victims were in critical condition. The woman, who had managed to hide herself during the attack, was able to call for help. Tragically, her husband succumbed to his injuries shortly after being transported to the hospital. The police immediately launched an investigation into the crime, hoping to find the perpetrators quickly. The authorities were faced with numerous challenges in their search for the robbers. The criminals had been careful in planning their escape, leaving few traces behind. However, through forensic evidence, witness accounts, and surveillance footage from nearby homes, the police were able to track down several individuals connected to the crime. It was revealed that the suspects were members of a larger crime ring involved in various robberies across the city. This group had been involved in similar crimes in the past, but they had managed to avoid capture due to the difficulty in linking them directly to specific incidents. In the days following the robbery, the public reaction was one of outrage and sadness. The victim's family, friends, and the wider community were devastated by the loss of life. The case quickly gained media attention, and it sparked widespread discussions about the rise of organized crime and the increasing violence in Argentina's major cities. People began questioning the effectiveness of the country's security policies and whether the authorities were doing enough to prevent such crimes from occurring in the first place. The victim's family, particularly his wife, became vocal in their call for justice. They demanded that the government take immediate action to address the root causes of crime and improve the safety of citizens. In the weeks that followed, local protests were organized, and many people came out to support the victim's family, expressing solidarity with those affected by similar crimes. At the same time, the police worked tirelessly to gather more evidence and locate the remaining members of the crime syndicate. It was later discovered that the criminals had been operating under the radar for years, planning and executing a series of robberies across the city with no regard for the harm they caused. Their motivations appeared to be driven by greed and a desire to escape their difficult financial situations, a motive that did little to justify the violence they inflicted on innocent people. In early December 2018, one of the main suspects, a man in his 30s named Juan Carlos Figueroa, was captured by the police. Figueroa had been identified through surveillance footage and his connections to previous crimes. Once arrested, he led the authorities to the rest of the gang, including a man named Ricardo Rojas, who had been responsible for planning the robbery and orchestrating the attack. The arrests were a significant step in solving the case, but it did little to alleviate the pain of the victim's family. For them, justice would only be served when the perpetrators were held fully accountable for their actions. As the case progressed through the judicial system, there were mixed reactions from the public. Many people felt that the punishment for such crimes should be more severe, while others called for reforms to address the underlying causes of crime, such as poverty and lack of opportunity. For the victim's family, however, no legal outcome could ever bring back the life that had been lost. By the end of 2018, the case had become a symbol of the ongoing struggle against crime and violence in Argentina. The brutal murder of an innocent man, coupled with the emotional toll on his family, left a lasting impression on the country. It underscored the need for stronger policies to combat organized crime, enhance police response times, and improve safety for all citizens, particularly those living in vulnerable neighborhoods. The tragic incident of November 16, 2018, ultimately became a part of the broader national conversation about crime in Argentina. It highlighted the real fears and dangers that citizens face in their daily lives, as well as the urgency with which the government and society must address issues like organized crime, poverty, and inequality. While the legal system continued to pursue justice in the case, the emotional scars of the crime would remain with the family and the community for years to come. As the investigation into the November 2018 robbery and homicide case continued, the focus shifted to the trial of the perpetrators. With the main suspects captured and arrested, including Juan Carlos Figueroa and Ricardo Rojas, the legal system moved forward with prosecution, but the case highlighted significant challenges facing Argentina's justice system. The trial began in early 2019, and it became a public spectacle. The media closely followed the proceedings, and the case garnered widespread attention across Argentina. The victim's family, particularly his wife, continued to seek justice, participating in the courtroom proceedings and attending hearings. Their determination to ensure that the perpetrators were held accountable became a powerful symbol of the personal toll that violent crimes take on individuals and families. Figueroa and Rojas, along with others involved in the crime, faced serious charges, including murder, armed robbery, and assault. The evidence against them was overwhelming, including witness testimonies, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence that connected the suspects to the crime scene. Despite this, the legal process was slow, and there were concerns about the possibility of delays or leniency in the punishment. The Argentine public was growing increasingly frustrated with the pace of the judicial process, which seemed to drag on for months, leaving the victim's family in emotional limbo. One of the central issues raised during the trial was the effectiveness of the legal system in dealing with organized crime syndicates. Many in Argentina felt that the country's justice system had failed to prevent these types of crimes, and that those responsible for such crimes often faced minimal consequences. The perception of impunity was particularly strong in cases involving organized crime groups, who were often seen as operating outside the reach of the law. This sense of injustice led to calls for reform and greater transparency in the judicial process. For the victim's family, the lengthy legal proceedings felt like a continuation of their suffering. The wife of the murdered man frequently spoke out in the media, calling for more swift and decisive action from the courts. Her voice echoed the sentiments of many other families who had been affected by violent crime in Argentina. The family's frustration was compounded by the continued prevalence of organized crime in the country, which seemed to operate with little regard for the safety or well-being of ordinary citizens. The trial also underscored the challenges that law enforcement and the judicial system face in combating organized crime. The criminals involved in the case were part of a larger criminal network that had been operating in Buenos Aires for years, carrying out robberies, drug trafficking, and other illicit activities. While the authorities were able to apprehend the main suspects, there were concerns about the ability of the police and the courts to dismantle these criminal networks fully. In the aftermath of the case, there were calls for stronger measures to prevent organized crime and improve public safety. Many Argentinians argued that the government needed to allocate more resources to law enforcement and take a harder stance against criminal organizations. Public opinion also demanded better support for victims of crime and their families, especially in terms of providing resources for legal representation and emotional support during the judicial process. As the trial proceeded, some witnesses testified that the crime syndicate to which the perpetrators belonged had ties to other illegal activities, such as human trafficking and money laundering. This added a layer of complexity to the case and drew attention to the broader scope of organized crime in Argentina. As a result, the investigation expanded to examine potential links between the robbery and larger criminal operations, leading to further arrests and interrogations of other individuals connected to the syndicate. In addition to the legal and law enforcement aspects of the case, the murder also highlighted the societal challenges that Argentina was facing in terms of economic inequality and rising violence. The criminals involved in the case were believed to have been motivated by financial desperation, exacerbated by Argentina's ongoing economic struggles, including inflation and unemployment. The case raised important questions about how social inequality and poverty contribute to crime and what measures could be taken to address the root causes of violence. In the end, the trial concluded with a verdict in late 2019. Figueroa and Rojas were found guilty of the murder and robbery, and they received significant prison sentences. However, the outcome was met with mixed reactions. Many people felt that the sentences were not enough to reflect the severity of the crime and the pain caused to the victim's family. There were also concerns that the case had not done enough to address the broader issues of organized crime and its links to poverty, unemployment, and social instability in Argentina. While the trial was seen as a success in bringing the perpetrators to justice, it also reinforced the perception that the Argentine legal system was slow, inefficient, and at times overly lenient with criminals, particularly those involved in organized crime. Many people felt that the case was just one example of a much larger problem that required systemic changes in the way crime was dealt with in the country. In the wake of the trial, the public discourse in Argentina shifted toward discussions about police reform, better economic policies, and strategies to combat organized crime. The government announced plans to invest in the modernization of the police force and improve training programs to better equip officers to handle complex cases involving organized crime. There were also calls for social policies aimed at reducing poverty and addressing inequality, which many believed were key drivers of crime. The case of the robbery and homicide in Buenos Aires in 2018 ultimately became more than just a local crime story. It became a reflection of Argentina's ongoing struggles with crime, inequality, and the effectiveness of its justice system. While the victim's family found some measure of closure through the conviction of the perpetrators, the case served as a stark reminder of the challenges that the country faced in achieving a safer and more just society. This tragic event became a catalyst for broader conversations about public safety, organized crime, and social justice. The discussions surrounding this case continue to shape public policy and societal attitudes toward crime and punishment in Argentina, underscoring the need for reform and greater focus on addressing the underlying causes of violence. Let's jump to next story. Story 10. In 2018, Argentina was shaken by a case that brought national attention to the issue of organized crime and violent theft. The case took place in the city of Buenos Aires, a bustling metropolis that is known for its vibrant culture, but also struggles with rising crime rates. One of the most notable criminal events of that year involved a group of criminals who planned and executed a daring robbery that would end in tragedy. This crime, though involving elements of theft and violence, highlighted some important issues concerning the safety of citizens, the effectiveness of law enforcement, and the criminal justice system in Argentina. It all began on the morning of May 22, 2018, when a family of 4 living in the suburban area of Villa Devoto in Buenos Aires fell victim to a violent home invasion. The family consisted of a couple in their early 40s and their 2 teenage children, ages 16 and 18. The family had been living in their home for several years, and although the area was generally considered safe, like many parts of Buenos Aires, it had begun to experience a rise in robberies and other criminal activities. The robbers, who had been keeping an eye on the neighborhood for several days, knew that the family often had valuable items in the house, including electronics, jewelry, and cash. They also knew that the family would be home that day, making the house an ideal target. The criminals meticulously planned the robbery and arrived at the house early in the morning. Their plan was simple: break in, steal valuables, and leave quickly without leaving any trace of their presence. The first sign of trouble came when one of the robbers, a man in his late 30s, approached the front door of the family's home. He rang the doorbell and pretended to be a delivery man, carrying a package that he claimed was for the family. When the door was opened by the father, the man pushed his way inside and pulled out a weapon. At that moment, the family realized that they were being robbed. The other members of the gang, who had been waiting outside, quickly stormed the house and began to search for valuables. The robbers were armed and aggressive, demanding money, electronics, and anything they could find that was of value. The family, terrified and unsure of what to do, complied with the robbers' demands, hoping that it would keep them safe. They handed over cash, credit cards, and several valuable items that the criminals had identified. Despite their cooperation, the robbers continued to ransack the house, looking for more items to steal. During this chaotic scene, the father of the family tried to protect his children. In an act of bravery, he attempted to confront one of the robbers and prevent him from accessing a safe that was hidden in the master bedroom. This decision would prove to be fatal. As the father struggled to stop the robber from opening the safe, one of the accomplices grabbed him from behind and shoved him to the ground. Fearing that the situation was escalating and that the police might soon arrive, the robbers made a snap decision. They were no longer willing to leave the scene without committing more violence. In a swift and cruel moment, the robbers decided to fatally harm the father. He was struck with a blunt object, which caused him to lose consciousness. As the situation worsened, the robbers fled the house with the stolen goods, leaving the family in shock and horror. The first responders arrived shortly after the robbers had left, but it was too late. The father of the family had succumbed to his injuries and was pronounced dead at the scene. The family members, although physically unharmed, were left traumatized by the brutal act of violence they had just witnessed. The authorities immediately launched an investigation into the crime, but there were few clues left behind by the perpetrators. The robbers had been careful to cover their tracks, and no one had seen their faces clearly enough to provide an accurate description. The investigation was complicated by the fact that the robbers were part of a larger criminal organization, which specialized in home invasions and other types of violent theft. The group was known to target affluent neighborhoods in Buenos Aires, carefully selecting their victims and planning their attacks with precision. The authorities believed that the criminals were well organized and operated with a clear strategy. They had likely been watching the family for several days, learning their routines and identifying weaknesses in the security of their home. Despite the challenges in gathering evidence, the police were able to trace the stolen items to a local pawn shop. The shop owner, who had been unaware that the goods were stolen, provided investigators with crucial information that eventually led to the identification of the suspects. Several members of the criminal gang were arrested and charged with various offenses, including murder, theft, and conspiracy. However, not all of the robbers were caught immediately. Some managed to evade capture, which raised concerns about the strength and reach of the criminal organization. As the case gained more media attention, the public reaction was one of outrage and disbelief. People were horrified that such a violent crime could occur in their own neighborhoods. The murder of an innocent man in his own home, in front of his family, was a stark reminder of the dangers posed by organized crime and violent criminals. It also raised questions about the safety of citizens in Argentina, particularly in urban areas like Buenos Aires, where crime rates had been steadily increasing in recent years. The crime had a profound impact on the victim's family, who were left to cope with the trauma of losing a loved one in such a violent manner. The wife, who had been forced to witness her husband's death, struggled with overwhelming grief and feelings of helplessness. Their children, too, faced the emotional scars of the attack, as they had witnessed their father's final moments. In the wake of the tragedy, the family became advocates for stronger security measures and better protection for citizens, hoping that their loss would bring about change in the country's approach to crime and law enforcement. The case also sparked a broader conversation about crime prevention and the need for reforms to Argentina's justice system. Many citizens began to question whether enough was being done to address the root causes of crime, such as poverty, unemployment, and lack of education. Others called for a more robust police presence in high-crime areas, and for tougher penalties for criminals involved in violent acts. The tragic murder brought together communities and sparked discussions about how to make Argentina a safer place for everyone. The aftermath of the tragic robbery and murder in Villa Devoto, Buenos Aires, reverberated across the city and the country. The public's outrage at the brutal act of violence was palpable, and there was a growing demand for justice for the victim's family. The investigation into the crime, although initially slow, began to pick up momentum as detectives worked tirelessly to uncover leads and piece together the details of the robbery. In addition to the emotional toll on the victim's family, the case shed light on the larger issues of organized crime, safety, and law enforcement in Argentina. The police made significant progress in their investigation, despite the challenges of the crime being committed by a well-organized group of criminals. One of the most important breakthroughs in the case came when the authorities managed to trace some of the stolen items to a local pawn shop. The shop owner, who had no idea the goods were stolen, cooperated with the investigation, providing valuable information that helped the police connect the stolen property to the criminal gang responsible for the attack. This clue eventually led to the identification of several of the perpetrators involved in the robbery. As the police tracked down the suspects, it became clear that the robbery was not an isolated incident. The group of criminals, who had been operating in various parts of Buenos Aires, had committed multiple similar robberies over the course of several months. Their modus operandi, carefully surveilling potential targets and executing swift, violent home invasions, had allowed them to avoid capture up until that point. This revealed the scope of the problem. Organized crime groups were increasingly involved in violent thefts, and the authorities struggled to combat them effectively. Through a combination of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and surveillance footage from nearby homes, the police were able to identify the core members of the gang. Several arrests were made, including that of the man who had entered the house pretending to be a delivery person, and the accomplices who had assisted in the robbery and murder. However, not all the criminals were apprehended immediately, and the police continued to search for the remaining members of the gang. By mid-2019, the judicial system began to move forward with the prosecution of the arrested individuals. The trial, which would ultimately determine the fate of the criminals, was closely watched by the media and the public. Many citizens had been following the case closely, and the family of the victim remained vocal about their desire for justice. The wife of the murdered man, who had been a witness to the crime, became an outspoken advocate for stricter laws and better protection for victims of violent crime. Her statements in the media underscored the emotional pain that such a traumatic experience left on families, and called for changes in both the legal system and social policies to address the root causes of crime. The trial was lengthy and complex. The defense argued that the robbers were desperate individuals who had committed the crime due to financial hardship. However, the evidence against them was undeniable, and the prosecution emphasized the extreme violence that had been used during the robbery. In addition to the murder charge, the criminals faced charges of armed robbery, illegal possession of firearms, and other crimes related to the home invasion. After months of legal proceedings, the court found the main suspects guilty of murder and armed robbery. The sentences handed down were significant, with some criminals receiving lengthy prison terms. However, the outcome of the trial did little to satisfy many members of the public, who felt that the sentences were not harsh enough, considering the violent nature of the crime. There was a growing sense of frustration with the justice system in Argentina, as many believed that criminals involved in violent acts, particularly organized crime syndicates, should face more severe consequences. The trial's conclusion did not mark the end of the conversation surrounding the case. On the contrary, it sparked a nationwide discussion about the state of crime in Argentina and how it was being handled by the authorities. Many people began to question whether the government was doing enough to tackle the underlying causes of crime, such as poverty, unemployment, and inequality. Calls for stronger police presence in neighborhoods affected by high crime rates, as well as for improved law enforcement training, grew louder. The case brought to light the fact that the police were often outmatched by criminal groups who operated with sophistication and organization. Beyond the legal implications, the case had a profound impact on public sentiment in Argentina. The emotional toll on the victim's family was immense, and their grief was compounded by the perception that crime was becoming more rampant and harder to control. The loss of a family member in such a violent and senseless way prompted many citizens to rethink their own safety and the protection offered by law enforcement. In the months following the trial, discussions about crime prevention and judicial reform became more common in public forums, including the media and political debates. The tragic incident also ignited discussions about the need for broader social reforms to address the root causes of criminal behavior. Advocates for economic and social justice argued that tackling poverty and improving education and job opportunities were critical steps in reducing crime and violence in Argentina. These conversations began to focus on the idea that a comprehensive approach, rather than simply focusing on law enforcement, would be necessary to combat organized crime and improve public safety. The case also raised concerns about the treatment of victims of crime within the judicial system. The victim's wife, in particular, spoke out about how the legal process had affected her family, urging that more be done to support victims' families and ensure that their voices were heard during trials. She became a strong advocate for victims' rights, calling for laws to be reformed to better protect and support those who had suffered at the hands of criminals. By the end of 2019, the case of the robbery and homicide had become more than just a story of a single crime. It had become a focal point for a larger conversation about public safety, justice, and the effectiveness of Argentina's crime-fighting measures. The murder of the father and the subsequent trial of the perpetrators served as a grim reminder of the challenges facing the country in its fight against organized crime and violence. While the perpetrators were sentenced and some level of justice was achieved for the family, the social, legal, and economic issues that contributed to the crime remained unresolved. The case highlighted the need for systemic changes and greater cooperation between the public, law enforcement, and government to create a safer, more just society for all citizens.